What if everything you thought you knew about civilization was built on a lie? Not a small lie, but a foundational deception so profound that it shaped how billions of people across thousands of years understood human progress, cultural achievement, and the very meaning of being civilized. The word barbarian carries such weight in modern discourse that we rarely pause to examine its origins. Yet understanding this term proves essential to grasping how ancient civilizations viewed themselves and their neighbors, and more importantly, how that distorted view continues to poison our understanding of history today. Picture yourself standing in ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and Western civilization itself. The year is 480 BC, and the greatest empire the world has ever known is marching toward your city with an army so vast that witnesses claimed it drank rivers dry. The Persian king Xerxes commands forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands, warriors drawn from every corner of an empire stretching from Egypt to India. And what do the Greeks call these sophisticated soldiers from the world's most advanced administrative state? Barbaroi, barbarians. The concept emerged not from objective observation, but from the peculiar acoustic sensibilities of the ancient Greeks, who coined the term barbaros to describe anyone whose speech sounded like meaningless barbar sounds to their ears. This deceptively simple origin reveals the fundamentally ethnocentric nature of the designation from its inception. It described not inherent savagery or cultural inferiority, but simply the experience of hearing unfamiliar languages. The Persians, with their elaborate court ceremonies, their sophisticated postal system that could deliver messages across thousands of miles in days, their tolerance of diverse religions and cultures, their monumental architecture that still inspires awe today, all of this counted for nothing. They spoke differently, and therefore they were barbarians. Greek usage of barbaros initially carried no moral judgment whatsoever. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, employed the term descriptively when discussing Persians, Egyptians, and Scythians, without suggesting these peoples lacked civilizational sophistication. The Persians, after all, commanded a vast empire with advanced administrative systems, monumental architecture, and refined court culture that made Greek city-states look like provincial backwaters by comparison. Egyptian civilization predated Greek development by millennia, boasting achievements in mathematics, medicine, and engineering that Greeks themselves acknowledged and studied with reverent admiration. Herodotus recognized these accomplishments, while still categorizing these peoples as barbaroi, based purely on linguistic difference. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, one that would echo through millennia of human conflict and prejudice. The semantic evolution of barbaros accelerated during the Persian Wars of the early 5th century BC, as Greek city-states fought for survival against Xerxes' massive invasion force. The term began acquiring political and cultural connotations beyond its original linguistic meaning. Victory at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea transformed barbarian from a neutral descriptor into a rallying cry that distinguished Greek freedom from Persian despotism, Greek rationality from barbarian excess, Greek moderation from barbarian luxury. This transformation reflected genuine cultural differences, but it also represented something far more insidious: the deliberate construction of an other against which Greek identity could be defined. The Greeks observed Persian court rituals requiring prostration before the king, a practice called proskynesis that struck Greeks as servile and degrading. Persian displays of wealth appeared ostentatious compared to Greek ideals of restraint. But were these observations accurate assessments of cultural difference, or were they the self-serving interpretations of a people desperate to believe their own superiority? Aristotle formalized these distinctions in his political philosophy. arguing that some peoples were naturally suited for slavery, while Greeks possessed inherent capacities for self-governance. His theories provided intellectual justification for viewing barbarians as fundamentally different in nature, rather than merely culture. This philosophical framework proved enormously influential, establishing patterns of thought that would persist for centuries and provide convenient justification for conquest, enslavement, and cultural destruction. When you hear modern politicians speak of civilized nations versus rogue states, when you see news coverage that portrays some cultures as inherently violent or backward, you are hearing echoes of Aristotle's ancient prejudice dressed in contemporary language. Aristotle's student Alexander the Great complicated these categories through his conquests, adopting Persian customs and encouraging cultural fusion between Greek and Eastern traditions. Yet even Alexander's cosmopolitan vision maintained Greek cultural superiority as its foundation. He might wear Persian robes and marry Persian princesses, but he never doubted that Greek culture represented the pinnacle of human achievement. His empire spread Greek language and customs across vast territories, but it also demonstrated that barbarian peoples could adopt civilized ways, a patronizing assumption that would characterize colonial attitudes for millennia to come. Roman encounters with the Greek concept of barbarism initially placed Romans themselves in the barbarian category. Early Greek writers dismissed Roman culture as crude and derivative, their language harsh compared to melodious Greek, their customs primitive compared to refined Hellenic traditions. This classification stung Roman pride and motivated intense efforts to demonstrate cultural sophistication worthy of Greek respect. Romans studied Greek literature, philosophy, and art with remarkable dedication, eventually surpassing their teachers in certain fields while maintaining fierce pride in distinctly Roman achievements. The irony here is profound and instructive. The Romans, who would eventually conquer the Greeks and build the greatest empire the Mediterranean world had ever seen, began their rise to power as barbarians in Greek eyes. Their transformation from barbarian outsiders to civilized conquerors demonstrates the arbitrary and politically convenient nature of these cultural categories. Barbarism, it turns out, was never about objective cultural achievement. It was about power, perspective, and the human need to believe in one's own superiority. Roman adoption of the barbarian concept transformed it into something far more systematic and politically useful than its Greek predecessor. Where Greeks applied the term somewhat inconsistently based on cultural prejudices and immediate political circumstances, Romans developed a more structured understanding that served imperial administration. The Roman version of barbarism became a tool for justifying conquest, organizing provincial governance, and maintaining social hierarchies throughout their expanding territories. Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars demonstrate this Roman transformation of the barbarian concept with chilling clarity. Caesar described Gallic tribes with ethnographic precision, noting their military capabilities, political structures, and religious practices. His accounts reveal peoples with complex societies, skilled metalwork, sophisticated fortifications, and effective military organization. Yet Caesar consistently portrayed these achievements as evidence of barbarian potential that required Roman guidance to reach full development. Consider the implications of this framing. The Gauls possessed learning and authority through their druids, but their human sacrifices marked them as savage. Gallic warriors showed courage and skill, but their lack of discipline made them inferior to Roman legions. Celtic craftsmanship produced beautiful objects, but Roman engineering created lasting monuments. Every Gallic achievement was acknowledged only to be diminished, every capability recognized only to be subordinated to Roman superiority. This was not objective ethnography. It was propaganda designed to justify conquest, while simultaneously warning Roman readers about barbarian capabilities. Caesar's descriptions served multiple purposes beyond simple military reporting. They justified Roman intervention as a civilizing mission, while simultaneously warning Roman readers about barbarian capabilities that required vigilant suppression. The Helvetii possessed enough organization to plan massive migrations. The Belgae commanded confederations spanning vast territories. Germanic tribes across the Rhine threatened Gallic stability with their warrior culture and land hunger. These portrayals emphasized both barbarian inferiority and barbarian danger, creating a narrative framework that made Roman conquest appear both beneficial and necessary. Tacitus refined this approach in his ethnographic works, particularly the Germania, which provided Romans with their most detailed account of Germanic peoples. Tacitus wrote with literary skill and anthropological insight, describing Germanic social structures, religious practices, and daily life with remarkable detail. Germanic warriors bound themselves to chiefs through personal loyalty rather than state authority. Germanic women enjoyed higher status than their Roman counterparts, participating in religious ceremonies and influencing political decisions. Germanic tribes valued personal honor above material wealth, preferring death to dishonor in battle. But here's where Tacitus becomes truly fascinating and subversive. These observations contained implicit criticisms of Roman society, where Tacitus saw corruption, luxury, and moral decay replacing the virtues that had built the empire. Germanic simplicity contrasted favorably with Roman complexity. Germanic authenticity with Roman artificiality. Germanic freedom with Roman servitude to emperors. Tacitus was using the barbarians as a mirror to reflect Roman failings, a literary technique that would be repeated countless times throughout Western history whenever writers wanted to critique their own societies. Yet Tacitus never abandoned the fundamental barbarian framework. Germanic virtues remained primitive and undeveloped compared to Roman civilization at its best. Germanic courage lacked Roman discipline. Germanic freedom lacked Roman law. Germanic simplicity lacked Roman culture. Even when praising barbarian qualities, Roman writers could not escape the assumption of their own cultural superiority. The barbarians might possess admirable traits, but they remained fundamentally inferior noble savages, whose virtues were those of children or animals rather than civilized adults. Herodotus had established patterns of barbarian description that later writers followed and refined across centuries. His accounts of Scythian customs, their mobile lifestyle, their ritual practices, their resistance to Persian conquest created templates for understanding nomadic people that would be applied indiscriminately to diverse groups regardless of their actual characteristics. Scythians lived in wagons rather than cities, worshipped strange gods with unusual ceremonies, and fought with tactics that confounded conventional armies. These characteristics became standard elements in barbarian descriptions applied to various peoples, regardless of their actual diversity. The Scythian example proved particularly influential because it demonstrated barbarian military effectiveness against civilized powers. Darius the Great's failed invasion of Scythia showed that barbarian warfare could defeat Persian imperial forces through mobility, knowledge of terrain, and unconventional tactics. This lesson resonated with later Roman observers facing similar challenges from Germanic tribes, Dacians, and other peoples who refused to fight according to Mediterranean military conventions. The barbarians might be culturally inferior, but they were militarily dangerous, a combination that justified both contempt and fear. Roman historians expanded these descriptive patterns into comprehensive frameworks for an understanding barbarian societies that would influence European thought for nearly 2 millennia. Barbarians lived in forests, mountains, or steppes rather than cities. They practiced polygamy, human sacrifice, or other customs that violated Roman moral standards. They lacked written laws, formal education, and permanent architecture. They valued warfare above peaceful pursuits, personal loyalty above legal obligation, and tribal identity above universal citizenship. These characteristics appeared consistently in Roman descriptions of diverse peoples from Britain to Mesopotamia, suggesting systematic application of preconceived categories rather than careful observation of actual differences. The political utility of barbarian classification became most apparent in Roman legal and administrative practices. Roman law distinguished between citizens, allies, and barbarians with different rights, obligations, and protection. Barbarian status justified enslavement, territorial conquest, and cultural suppression, while simultaneously offering pathways to civilization through Roman tutelage. Successful barbarian leaders could earn Roman citizenship. Barbarian warriors could serve in auxiliary units. Barbarian territories could achieve provincial status through demonstrated loyalty and cultural adaptation. This system created incentives for barbarian peoples to adopt Roman customs while maintaining clear hierarchies that preserved Roman superiority. A Gallic aristocrat might wear Roman dress, speak Latin, and serve Roman administration while remaining fundamentally barbarian in Roman eyes until formal citizenship was granted. Even then, recently civilized barbarians faced suspicion and discrimination from established Roman families, who questioned their cultural authenticity and political reliability. The path from barbarism to civilization was always available in theory, but in practice it remained a journey that could never be fully completed. Archaeological evidence reveals the complexity of these cultural interactions, showing extensive trade networks, artistic influences, and technological exchanges between Roman and barbarian territories that classical sources systematically ignored or minimized. Roman goods appeared in Germanic settlements far beyond imperial borders. Barbarian craftsmanship influenced Roman decorative styles. Military equipment and techniques spread in both directions across cultural boundaries. These material exchanges suggest relationships far more nuanced than simple civilized versus barbarian opposition. Yet literary sources consistently maintained rigid categorical distinctions that obscured actual complexity. The persistence of barbarian stereotypes reflects their usefulness for maintaining social cohesion and political authority within classical civilizations. External threats unified internal populations. Foreign customs validated domestic practices. Cultural superiority justified political dominance. These functions remained constant even as specific barbarian peoples changed, disappeared, or achieved civilized status themselves. New barbarians always appeared to replace those who had been conquered, converted, or assimilated, maintaining the essential framework that distinguished civilization from its alternatives. Modern scholarship has revealed the extent to which classical sources shaped enduring misconceptions about ancient European peoples. Archaeological investigations show sophisticated societies with complex political structures, advanced technologies, and rich cultural traditions among peoples dismissed as primitive barbarians by Greek and Roman writers. The Celts developed intricate legal systems, astronomical knowledge, and artistic traditions of remarkable sophistication. Germanic peoples created elaborate social hierarchies, extensive trade networks, and religious practices of considerable complexity. Thracians, Dacians, and other Balkan peoples built fortified cities, minted coins, and maintained diplomatic relations across vast distances. These revelations about classical bias prove particularly significant when examining the peoples who would eventually transform the Roman world. For the barbarians were not simply waiting in the forests to destroy civilization. They were building their own civilizations, developing their own technologies, creating their own art and literature and law. And when they finally crossed the frontiers of the Roman Empire, they brought with them not destruction but transformation, not the end of civilization but its rebirth in new and unexpected forms. But before we can understand that transformation, we must first understand who these peoples really were. Stripped of Roman prejudice and romantic mythology alike, we must journey into the forests and hills of ancient Europe, where Celtic civilization flourished in ways that would astonish anyone who accepted classical descriptions at face value. for the Celts were not primitive savages lurking at the edges of the civilized world. They were the creators of one of Europe's most sophisticated prehistoric cultures, masters of metalwork and art, law and religion, whose achievements rivaled and sometimes surpassed those of their Mediterranean neighbors. The mist rises from the valleys of ancient Gaul as dawn breaks over a landscape that would be unrecognizable to modern eyes. Where today you might see orderly French farmland, imagine instead vast forests of oak and beech, punctuated by hilltop fortresses whose ramparts rise 100 feet above the surrounding countryside. Within those walls, tens of thousands of people live, work, and worship, according to traditions stretching back beyond memory. This is the Celtic world at its height, and it is nothing like what Roman writers wanted you to believe. By the 8th century BC, Celtic peoples had begun their remarkable expansion across the European continent, establishing settlements from the Atlantic shores of Ireland to the highlands of central Anatolia. This expansion occurred not through massive military campaigns like later Roman conquests, but through gradual migration, trade relationships, and cultural diffusion that created a vast Celtic world united by shared languages, artistic traditions, and religious practices. The Celts were not a single nation or empire, but a civilization, a way of life that spread across thousands of miles and endured for nearly a millennium. The Elatene culture, named after the Swiss archaeological site where distinctive Celtic artifacts were first systematically studied, flourished from approximately 450 BC to the Roman conquest of Gaul. Latene metalwork demonstrates technical mastery that rivals any contemporary civilization, including Rome itself. Celtic smiths developed advanced techniques for working iron and bronze, creating weapons, tools, and decorative objects of extraordinary quality. Their long swords, forged from high-carbon steel with pattern-welded blades, proved superior to Roman gladii in individual combat. Celtic shields, constructed from wood and leather with iron bosses, featured intricate decorative patterns that served both aesthetic and spiritual purposes. Consider what this means for our understanding of barbarian technology. The Romans, who prided themselves on their engineering achievements, faced enemies whose swords were actually better than their own. The Celtic smiths who forged these weapons possessed metallurgical knowledge that took centuries to develop, knowledge passed down through generations of master craftsmen who understood the properties of different metals, the effects of various heat treatments, and the techniques required to create blades that were simultaneously hard enough to hold an edge and flexible enough to absorb impact without shattering. Celtic artistic achievement extended far beyond functional metalwork into realms of pure aesthetic expression that continue to influence art and design today. The distinctive curvilinear style that characterizes Elatene art combines geometric precision with organic, flowing forms that seem to capture natural movement in static bronze and stone. Celtic artisans created torques, twisted metal neck rings, of remarkable sophistication, some weighing several pounds, and featuring terminals carved with faces, animals, or abstract designs of stunning complexity. The Gundestrup cauldron, discovered in Denmark but clearly of Celtic manufacture, displays narrative scenes of gods, warriors, and ritual activities rendered with artistic skill that demonstrates profound mythological knowledge and technical expertise. This massive silver vessel, nearly 70 centimeters in diameter, depicts scenes that scholars are still working to interpret: gods with antlers, warriors being dipped in cauldrons, processions of armed men and sacred animals. The craftsmanship required to create such an object, the silver working, the repoussé technique, the gilding, represents the pinnacle of ancient European metalwork. Archaeological evidence reveals Celtic settlements far more complex than the simple villages described in Roman sources. The great hill fort of Maiden Castle in Dorset covered 47 acres within multiple defensive ramparts that rose over 100 feet above the surrounding countryside. These ramparts, constructed through sophisticated engineering techniques, incorporated timber-laced stone walls that could withstand prolonged siege warfare. Within such fortifications, Celtic communities maintained organized street layouts, specialized craft workshops, and storage facilities that indicate centralized planning and social hierarchy. The oppida, fortified towns that emerged across Celtic Europe during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, represented urban development comparable to contemporary Mediterranean cities. Bibracte, the capital of the Aedui in Gaul, covered over 300 acres and housed an estimated 10,000 inhabitants. Streets paved with stone-connected residential districts, craft quarters, and ceremonial areas. Workshops produced goods for long-distance trade, including glassware, pottery, and metalwork that reached markets from Britain to the Black Sea. Coinage minted at Bibracte and other oppida demonstrates Celtic adoption and adaptation of Mediterranean monetary systems, with designs that blend classical motifs with distinctly Celtic artistic elements. These were not primitive villages huddled in forest clearings. These were cities, with all the complexity that urban life implies: specialized craftsmen, merchants, priests, administrators, and the infrastructure required to support them. The Celts had developed urban civilization independently, creating their own solutions to the challenges of organizing large populations and managing complex economies. Celtic social organization operated through complex hierarchical structures that balanced aristocratic authority with communal decision-making in ways that would later influence medieval European governance. At the apex stood warrior nobles, who derived status from military prowess, cattle ownership, and the ability to attract and maintain armed retainers. These aristocrats lived in substantial timber halls within fortified compounds, surrounded by craftsmen, servants, and agricultural workers who provided the economic foundation for Celtic society. Warrior bands bound by personal loyalty to aristocratic leaders formed the military core of Celtic communities, similar to the comitatus system later observed among Germanic peoples. The druids occupied a unique position within Celtic society that combined religious, legal, and educational functions in ways that had no parallel in the Mediterranean world. These learned men, and occasionally women, underwent training periods lasting up to 20 years, memorizing vast bodies of oral tradition that included religious doctrine, legal precedents, historical genealogies, and astronomical knowledge. Druids served as judges in legal disputes, conducting trials according to customary law that covered everything from property rights to criminal punishment. Their decisions carried authority across tribal boundaries, creating a unified legal system that transcended political divisions. Think about what this means. The Celts had developed a professional class of judges, priests, and scholars whose authority was recognized across hundreds of miles and dozens of independent political units. They had created a legal system sophisticated enough to handle complex disputes over property, inheritance, and criminal liability. They had established educational institutions that required 2 decades of study to complete, and they had done all of this without writing, or rather, while deliberately choosing not to write down their most sacred knowledge. Druidical education centered on memorization rather than written texts, preserving Celtic traditions through oral transmission that ensured cultural continuity across generations. Young druids learned to recite thousands of verses containing religious hymns, legal formulations, and historical narratives. This system produced individuals with prodigious memories, capable of preserving complex information with remarkable accuracy. Archaeological discoveries of wooden tablets with Ogham inscriptions suggest druids possessed knowledge of writing systems, but deliberately chose oral preservation for sacred knowledge, believing written texts lacked the spiritual power of spoken words. This choice was not a sign of primitiveness, but of sophisticated understanding of how knowledge functions in society. The druids understood that written texts could be copied, altered, and misinterpreted by those without proper training. Oral transmission, by contrast, required direct contact between teacher and student, ensuring that knowledge was passed down only to those deemed worthy and capable of understanding it properly. The druids were not illiterate barbarians, they were guardians of a different approach to knowledge preservation, one that prioritized accuracy and authority over accessibility. Celtic religious practices centered on the natural world, with sacred groves, springs, and hilltops serving as primary ceremonial sites. The druids conducted elaborate rituals marking seasonal transitions, agricultural cycles, and important community events. These ceremonies often involved animal sacrifice, with specific animals chosen according to the nature of the ritual and the deities being honored. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde reveals structured deposits of weapons, jewelry, and animal remains that indicate systematic ritual practices conducted over extended periods. Human sacrifice, while documented in classical sources and supported by archaeological evidence, occurred within specific religious contexts rather than as random violence. Bog bodies discovered across Celtic territories show evidence of ritual killing conducted according to prescribed methods, strangulation, throat cutting, and drowning, that suggests ceremonial rather than punitive execution. The Lindo man, discovered in an English peat bog, had consumed a ritual meal containing mistletoe before his death, indicating preparation for sacrifice according to druidical practices. These sacrifices likely occurred during major religious festivals or in response to community crises requiring divine intervention. The Romans used Celtic human sacrifice as evidence of barbarian savagery, conveniently ignoring their own traditions of ritual killing. Roman gladiatorial games, which killed thousands of people annually for public entertainment, were somehow considered civilized, while Celtic religious sacrifices were barbaric. The distinction reveals more about Roman propaganda than about actual cultural differences. Celtic warfare combined individual heroism with tactical sophistication that proved effective against both tribal enemies and Roman legions. Celtic warriors fought with long swords, spears, and shields while wearing minimal armor that emphasized mobility over protection. Their battle tactics relied on initial charges, designed to break enemy formations through shock and psychological intimidation. Warriors would advance while shouting war cries, clashing weapons against shields, and displaying individual prowess through combat challenges issued to enemy champions. The psychological aspects of Celtic warfare proved as important as physical combat skills. Warriors decorated their shields and weapons with designs intended to invoke divine protection and intimidate enemies. Some Celtic fighters painted their bodies with blue woad dye and fought naked to demonstrate fearlessness and spiritual power. War trumpets called carnix, shaped like elongated animal heads, produced haunting sounds that carried for miles and struck terror into opposing forces. These instruments, standing over 6 feet tall when fully extended, created acoustic effects that Roman soldiers found deeply unsettling. Celtic military organization operated through warrior bands, led by experienced champions who had proven themselves in combat. These leaders attracted followers through displays of courage, generosity, and success in battle. Young warriors competed for places in prestigious war bands, seeking opportunities to gain honor and material rewards through participation in raids and battles. The most successful warriors accumulated enough wealth and reputation to establish their own bands, creating networks of military alliance that could mobilize thousands of fighters when major conflicts arose. The resistance to Roman expansion produced Celtic leaders whose military and political skills challenged Roman assumptions about barbarian capabilities. Vercingetorix, the Arvernian chieftain who united Gallic tribes against Julius Caesar in 52 BC, demonstrated strategic thinking that nearly succeeded in expelling Roman forces from Gaul. His decision to abandon fixed positions and conduct mobile warfare using scorched earth tactics forced Caesar to adapt Roman military doctrine to counter unfamiliar enemy strategies. Vercingetorix understood that Celtic forces could not match Roman legions in conventional battle, so he developed alternative approaches that exploited Celtic advantages in mobility and local knowledge. He ordered the destruction of settlements and supplies that might benefit Roman forces, forcing Caesar's army to operate in hostile territory without reliable logistics. Celtic cavalry, superior to Roman horsemen in individual skill and knowledge of terrain, harassed Roman columns and prevented effective reconnaissance. These tactics prolonged the conflict and inflicted significant casualties on Roman forces accustomed to quicker victories against less organized opponents. The Siege of Alesia marked the climax of Gallic resistance and demonstrated both Celtic military capabilities and their ultimate limitations against Roman engineering and discipline. Vercingetorix chose to defend the hilltop oppidum of Alesia, believing its natural defenses and stored supplies would allow prolonged defense while relief forces gathered. Caesar responded by constructing double lines of fortifications, one facing the town, another facing outward, that created a trap for both the defenders and any relieving army. The engineering achievement of Caesar's siege works at Alesia rivaled any Roman construction project. The inner wall, stretching over 10 miles, incorporated timber palisades, earthen ramparts, concealed obstacles, and water-filled ditches designed to prevent sorties from the town. The outer wall, equally extensive, featured similar defenses oriented to repel attacks from relieving forces. Between these walls, Roman legions maintained positions that allowed them to fight on two fronts simultaneously while controlling access to food and water. The arrival of a massive Gallic relief army created the dramatic climax of the siege. Archaeological evidence suggests this force numbered in the tens of thousands, representing tribes from across Gaul, united in their final attempt to preserve independence. The battle that followed involved coordinated attacks from inside and outside the Roman fortifications, with Celtic forces attempting to break through at multiple points simultaneously. Roman discipline and engineering ultimately prevailed, but the scale and organization of Gallic resistance impressed even Roman observers. In Britain, Boudicca's rebellion in 60 AD demonstrated similar Celtic capabilities for large-scale military organization and strategic planning. The Iceni queen mobilized not only her own tribe but also the Trinovantes and other southeastern British peoples in a coordinated uprising that destroyed 3 major Roman settlements. The rebels sacked Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, killing an estimated 70,000 Roman colonists and British collaborators, according to Tacitus's account. Archaeological evidence from London reveals a distinctive red burn layer containing melted bronze and glass that marks the destruction of the early Roman city. Human remains found in the Walbrook stream show evidence of ritual mutilation, suggesting Celtic religious practices accompanied the military campaign. These discoveries confirm classical accounts of systematic destruction that went beyond simple military objectives to encompass religious and psychological warfare. The initial success of Boudicca's rebellion reflected sophisticated intelligence gathering and coordination among British tribes. The uprising began while the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus was campaigning in Anglesey against druidical strongholds, leaving southeastern Britain with reduced military protection. This timing suggests careful planning and communication networks that extended across tribal boundaries. The rebels also demonstrated knowledge of Roman military capabilities and limitations, avoiding pitched battles with legionary forces while targeting vulnerable civilian settlements. Celtic religious practices provided ideological foundation for resistance against Roman expansion. Druids taught that Roman conquest threatened not only political independence but also spiritual integrity, since Roman religious practices conflicted with Celtic beliefs about the proper relationship between humans and the natural world. The Roman destruction of sacred groves and prohibition of human sacrifice represented attacks on fundamental Celtic religious principles that required armed response to preserve divine favor. The role of Druids as resistance leaders reflected their position as guardians of Celtic cultural identity. These priests possessed knowledge of tribal genealogies, territorial boundaries, and traditional laws that predated Roman occupation. Their opposition to Roman rule carried religious authority that transcended political considerations, making them natural leaders for independence movements. Roman recognition of Druidical influence led to systematic persecution of the priesthood, including the assault on Anglesey that provided the opportunity for Boudicca's rebellion. Celtic fortification techniques evolved in response to Roman siege warfare, incorporating lessons learned from earlier conflicts. Multi-valid hill forts of southern Britain featured multiple defensive lines that forced attackers to overcome successive obstacles while exposing themselves to missile fire from defenders. These fortifications often included elaborate entrance systems with overlapping gates, guard chambers, and killing grounds where attackers could be trapped and destroyed. The complexity of such defensive arrangements indicates military engineering knowledge comparable to contemporary Roman fortification science. The Celtic world that Rome conquered was not a primitive wilderness waiting to be civilized. It was a sophisticated civilization with its own achievements in art, technology, law, and religion. The Romans did not bring civilization to the Celts. They imposed their own civilization on peoples who already possessed one. Understanding this distinction is crucial for understanding what happened when the Roman Empire itself began to crumble, and new peoples emerged from the forests to reshape the European world. For in those same forests, beyond the Rhine and the Danube, other peoples were watching, learning, and preparing. The Germanic tribes had observed Celtic resistance and Roman conquest. They had traded with both peoples, fought against both, and absorbed lessons from both. And when their time came, they would prove even more formidable than the Celts, not because they were more savage, but because they were more adaptable. The dense forests of northern Europe concealed societies that would fundamentally reshape the classical world through their relentless pressure against Roman frontiers. But these were not the howling savages of Roman imagination. They were sophisticated peoples with complex social structures, advanced technologies, and religious beliefs that gave meaning to their existence and courage to their warriors. To understand how they would eventually transform the Roman world, we must first understand who they really were. Germanic peoples emerged from archaeological obscurity during the 2nd century BC, when the Cimbri and Teutones launched their devastating migration southward, bringing them into direct collision with Roman power for the first time. These tribal confederations, driven by population pressure and climate deterioration in their Jutland homeland, swept through Gaul with an estimated 300,000 warriors and their families, overwhelming Celtic settlements and threatening Roman territorial integrity. in ways that previous barbarian incursions had never achieved. The Cimbrian migration began around 113 BC, when harsh winters and rising sea levels rendered their traditional territories uninhabitable. Archaeological evidence from Danish bog sites reveals dramatic environmental changes during this period, with pollen analysis indicating crop failures and settlement abandonment across wide areas of northern Europe. The Cimbrian response demonstrated organizational capabilities that Roman observers found deeply troubling. Rather than fragmenting under pressure, these tribes maintained cohesion across thousands of miles of movement while incorporating additional Germanic and Celtic groups into their confederation. Roman encounters with the Cimbri revealed military tactics unlike anything Mediterranean armies had previously faced. Germanic warriors fought in dense formations called the cuneus, or wedge, which concentrated maximum force at specific points in enemy lines while maintaining flexibility for rapid maneuvers. These formations relied on the psychological impact of massed war cries, weapon clashing, and the sight of tall, blonde warriors advancing with apparent fearlessness toward death. Roman legions, trained for disciplined combat against similar infantry formations, struggled against enemies who combined individual ferocity with collective tactical coherence. The disaster at Arausio in 105 BC demonstrated Germanic military effectiveness against professional Roman forces in the most catastrophic terms. Two consular armies, totaling approximately 120,000 men, including allies and auxiliaries, suffered complete destruction when Cimbrian and Teutonic forces exploited Roman command disputes to achieve tactical surprise. Germanic warriors overran Roman camps, slaughtered fleeing soldiers in nearby rivers, and captured military standards that became trophies in their religious ceremonies. The scale of this defeat exceeded even Cannae in terms of manpower losses and strategic implications for Roman security. Let that sink in for a moment. The Romans, who had conquered the Mediterranean world, who had defeated Hannibal and destroyed Carthage, lost more men at Arausio than in almost any other battle in their history, and they lost them to peoples they considered primitive barbarians. The Germanic tribes had demonstrated that they could not only resist Roman expansion, but could annihilate Roman armies in open battle. Gaius Marius's subsequent campaigns against the Germanic invaders revealed both Roman adaptability and Germanic limitations when facing reformed military organization. Marius restructured legionary training to emphasize individual combat skills while maintaining unit cohesion under extreme pressure. His soldiers learned to fight Germanic warriors in single combat while supporting nearby comrades, countering the Germanic emphasis on individual prowess with disciplined mutual assistance. The victories at Aquae Sextiae and Vercellae in 102 to 101 BC demonstrated that Germanic tactical advantages could be neutralized through superior Roman logistics engineering and sustained combat experience. But the Cimbrian Wars also taught the Romans a lesson they would never forget. The Germanic peoples were dangerous. They could field enormous armies. They could defeat Roman legions, and there were always more of them, waiting in the forests beyond the frontier. The Suebi represented a different model of Germanic organization that proved even more challenging for Roman frontier defense. Unlike the migrating Cimbri and Teutones, the Suebi maintained permanent territories east of the Rhine, while conducting regular military expeditions that kept neighboring peoples in constant fear. Tacitus described them as the most warlike of all Germanic tribes, practicing annual population exchanges that prevented territorial attachment while maintaining military readiness. Young Suebian warriors spent years in frontier regions, raiding enemies and perfecting combat skills before returning to establish households and raise the next generation of fighters. Suebian military culture centered on the principle that continuous warfare was essential for tribal survival and individual honor. They deliberately avoided agricultural surplus that might encourage peaceful settlement, instead relying on cattle herding and raiding to meet material needs. This lifestyle produced warriors whose entire identity revolved around combat effectiveness and personal courage in battle. Suebian chiefs gained authority through successful leadership in war rather than inherited status, creating competitive hierarchies that encouraged aggressive expansion against weaker neighbors. The social organization of Germanic tribes reflected their emphasis on warrior culture through institutions that bound fighting men to their leaders through personal loyalty rather than abstract political obligation. The comitatus system described by Tacitus represented the fundamental building block of Germanic society, creating relationships between chiefs and warriors that transcended kinship ties while establishing mutual obligations that governed both military and civilian life. Young men of good families sought admission to the war bands of renowned leaders, competing for recognition through displays of courage, skill, and absolute devotion to their chosen chief. Comitatus relationships involved elaborate gift exchanges that demonstrated the chief's generosity while binding warriors to his service through reciprocal obligations. Successful war leaders distributed weapons, horses, gold arm rings, and other valuables to their followers after victorious campaigns, creating cycles of obligation that required continued military success to maintain. Warriors who received such gifts became honor-bound to defend their chief's life with their own, fighting to the death rather than surviving their leader's fall in battle. This system produced military units of exceptional cohesion and fighting spirit that Roman observers found both admirable and dangerous. Germanic warfare emphasized individual heroism within collective tactical frameworks that maximized both personal glory and military effectiveness. Warriors advanced into battle wearing their finest weapons and ornaments, seeking opportunities to challenge enemy champions to single combat, while maintaining formation discipline that supported overall tactical objectives. The most prestigious warriors carried elaborately decorated shields, swords with pattern-welded blades, and spear points inscribed with runic symbols invoking divine protection. Archaeological discoveries from weapon deposits in Danish bogs reveal the extraordinary craftsmanship of Germanic military equipment, with some swords showing evidence of ritual destruction that suggests religious significance beyond mere functional value. These weapons were not simply tools of war. They were sacred objects imbued with spiritual power, connections between the warrior and the gods who watched over battle. The religious dimensions of Germanic warfare reflected beliefs that connected earthly combat with cosmic struggles between order and chaos. Warriors who died gloriously in battle earned admission to Valhalla, where they would feast with the gods while preparing for Ragnarok, the final battle that would determine the fate of the universe. This belief system encouraged extraordinary battlefield courage, while providing religious justification for aggressive expansion against neighboring peoples. Germanic priests accompanied war bands into battle, conducting sacrificial rituals before combat and interpreting omens that guided tactical decisions. Woden, known to later Scandinavian sources as Odin, served as the primary deity of Germanic warrior culture. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites across northern Europe reveals systematic weapon sacrifices dedicated to this god of war, death, and wisdom. The great weapon deposits at Illerup and Thorsberg contain thousands of spears, swords, and shields deliberately damaged before deposition, suggesting victory celebrations where captured enemy equipment was offered to Woden in gratitude for battlefield success. These sites also contain Roman military equipment, indicating Germanic victories against legionary forces that provided prestigious offerings for their war god. Thor represented another crucial aspect of Germanic religious life, serving as protector of human communities against the chaotic forces represented by giants and monsters. Archaeological discoveries of hammer-shaped amulets throughout Germanic territories demonstrate widespread devotion to this deity, whose weapon Mjolnir symbolized both destructive power and protective blessing. Thor's role as defender of cosmic order provided religious sanction for Germanic resistance against Roman expansion, which many tribes interpreted as an assault on traditional religious practices and social organization. The concept of Weird, or fate, played a central role in Germanic worldview, influencing both individual behavior and collective decision-making in ways that shaped their interactions with Roman civilization. Germanic peoples believed that individual destinies were predetermined by supernatural forces, but that personal courage and honor in fulfilling one's fate determined posthumous reputation and divine favor. This belief system encouraged acceptance of death in battle, while emphasizing the importance of achieving glory through heroic action. Warriors who fled from combat brought shame not only on themselves but on their entire lineage, while those who died courageously earned eternal honor for their families. Germanic migration patterns during the 3rd through 5th centuries AD reflected both external pressures and internal social dynamics that drove tribal movements across vast distances. The expansion of Hunnic power from the Pontic steppes created a domino effect that displaced Gothic confederations from their territories north of the Black Sea, forcing these peoples westward into conflict with Roman frontier defenses. Simultaneously, climate deterioration in northern Europe reduced agricultural productivity and increased competition for scarce resources, encouraging southern migration toward more favorable territories within the Roman Empire. Archaeological evidence reveals the complexity of these population movements, which involved not simple mass migrations, but gradual infiltration, military conquest, and cultural assimilation that transformed both Germanic and Roman societies. Germanic settlements within Roman territories often maintained traditional burial practices, ceramic styles, and metalwork techniques while adopting Roman architectural features and agricultural methods. This cultural blending created hybrid societies that preserved Germanic identity while adapting to Mediterranean economic and political systems. The pressure of Hunnic expansion fundamentally altered the balance of power along Roman frontiers by forcing Germanic tribes to choose between submission to steppe nomads or migration into Roman territory. The Hunnic military system, based on mounted archery and rapid maneuver, proved devastatingly effective against Germanic infantry formations that relied on close combat with spears and swords. Tribes that attempted to resist Hunnic expansion suffered catastrophic defeats that destroyed their military capacity and forced surviving populations to seek refuge across Roman borders. Climate change during the 4th and 5th centuries had exacerbated these political pressures by reducing agricultural productivity across northern Europe. Paleoclimatic data from ice cores and tree rings indicates cooling temperatures and increased precipitation that shortened growing seasons and reduced crop yields throughout Germanic territories. Archaeological evidence from abandoned settlements in Denmark and northern Germany confirms widespread population decline during this period, as communities struggled to maintain subsistence in deteriorating environmental conditions. Germanic religious practices adapted to these challenging circumstances through increased emphasis on divination and sacrifice, designed to influence supernatural forces controlling weather and agricultural fertility. Bog body discoveries from this period show evidence of elaborate ritual killings conducted according to specific religious protocols, suggesting community responses to crisis through human sacrifice intended to restore divine favor. The Tolland Man and other bog bodies display evidence of ritual preparation, including special meals and careful positioning, that indicates religious rather than criminal execution. The transformation of Germanic society under these pressures produced new forms of political organization that combined traditional warrior leadership with territorial administration capable of governing settled populations. Kings emerged from successful war leaders who could provide both military protection and effective governance for communities facing external threats and internal challenges. These rulers maintained traditional comitatus relationships with warrior followers, while developing administrative systems that managed agricultural production, craft specialization, and trade relationships necessary for territorial states. Germanic legal traditions evolved to address the complexities of settled life while preserving customary practices that maintained social cohesion and cultural identity. The development of written law codes during the 5th and 6th centuries AD reflected both Roman influence and Germanic legal principles that emphasized compensation rather than punishment for most crimes. These codes preserved traditional concepts of honor, kinship obligation, and personal responsibility while adapting to circumstances that required more complex dispute resolution mechanisms than tribal assemblies could provide. The military evolution of Germanic peoples during their encounters with Roman civilization produced tactical innovations that combined traditional fighting methods with lessons learned from observing legionary organization and equipment. Germanic warriors adopted Roman-style helmets, improved armor construction, and siege techniques while maintaining their emphasis on individual prowess and personal loyalty to war leaders. This military synthesis created armies capable of both guerrilla warfare in forest environments and conventional battles against Roman field forces. But the greatest transformation was yet to come. For out of the eastern steppes, a new force was emerging, one that would terrify Germanic and Roman alike, that would shatter existing power structures and create opportunities for ambitious leaders to reshape the world. The Huns were coming, and nothing would ever be the same. The emergence of Hunnic power from the vast steppes of Central Asia marked a pivotal transformation in the barbarian world, introducing a form of warfare and social organization that would fundamentally alter the balance of power across Eurasia. Unlike the Germanic tribes with their forest strongholds or the Celtic peoples with their hill forts, the Huns represented pure nomadic mobility, a society built entirely around the horse and the composite bow that could strike with devastating speed across distances that rendered traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Imagine you are a Gothic farmer in the year 370 AD, living in a prosperous settlement north of the Black Sea. Your people have dominated this region for generations. You have heard of the Romans to the south, traded with them, even fought alongside them. You feel secure in your world. Then one morning, riders appear on the horizon, strange riders on small, ugly horses, with faces that look nothing like any people you have ever seen. Before you can react, arrows begin falling like rain. Your warriors rush to form a shield wall, but the riders stay just out of reach, loosing arrow after arrow. When your men charge, the riders simply retreat, still shooting. When your men fall back exhausted, the riders charge in with swords and lances to finish the slaughter. This was the Hunnic way of war, and it was unlike anything Europe had ever experienced. Archaeological evidence from burial sites across the Mongolian steppes reveals the deep antiquity of nomadic cultures that would eventually coalesce into the Hunnic Confederation. Excavations at sites like Noin Ula have uncovered elaborate tombs dating to the 2nd century BC, containing Chinese silks, Roman glassware, and locally produced horse gear of extraordinary sophistication. These discoveries demonstrate the existence of complex trade networks spanning the entire Eurasian continent, with nomadic peoples serving as crucial intermediaries who connected Mediterranean civilizations with the Far East through their mastery of overland transportation. The origins of the specific tribal groups that would become known to Europeans as Huns remain partially obscured by the limitations of written sources and the archaeological challenges of tracking mobile populations across vast territories. Chinese chronicles from the Han Dynasty describe conflicts with nomadic confederations called the Xiongnu, whose military tactics and social organization bear striking resemblances to later Hunnic practices observed by Roman and Gothic sources. The Xiongnu employed massed cavalry archery, maintained hierarchical clan structures based on military prowess, and conducted systematic campaigns designed to extract tribute from settled agricultural populations. Chinese military treatises provide detailed accounts of Xiongnu warfare that illuminate the tactical innovations later employed by Hunnic forces against Germanic tribes and Roman armies. Xiongnu warriors fought exclusively on horseback, using powerful composite bows constructed from layers of wood, sinew, and horn that could penetrate armor at ranges exceeding 300 yards. These weapons required years of training to master effectively, but their range and penetrating power made them devastatingly effective against infantry formations that relied on close combat with spears and swords. The composite bow represented a technological achievement that gave nomadic peoples decisive military advantages over their settled neighbors. The construction process required specialized knowledge of animal anatomy, wood properties, and adhesive chemistry that was passed down through generations of skilled craftsmen. The finished weapons could maintain their effectiveness in extreme weather conditions that rendered other bow types useless, allowing nomadic armies to campaign throughout winter months when their enemies expected seasonal truces. Hunnic society organized itself around the fundamental unit of the Ordu, a military household that combined extended family relationships with warrior band loyalty in ways that created remarkably cohesive fighting forces. Each Ordu typically included several hundred warriors, along with their families, servants, and herds, forming self-sufficient communities that could operate independently while contributing to larger military campaigns when circumstances required. The leader of each Ordu held authority based on proven military success and the ability to provide for his followers through successful raids and diplomatic negotiations. The westward migration of Hunnic peoples during the 4th century AD created a cascade of displacement that affected every barbarian society, from the Volga River to the Atlantic Ocean. Gothic chroniclers describe the sudden appearance of Hunnic raiders north of the Black Sea around 370 AD, when mounted archers struck Gothic settlements with unprecedented speed and ferocity. The Goths, accustomed to warfare against Germanic infantry and Roman legions, possessed no effective defense against enemies who could loose volleys of arrows from horseback while remaining beyond the reach of Gothic spears and swords. The collapse of Gothic power under Hunnic pressure demonstrated the revolutionary nature of steppe warfare when applied against European military systems. The Gothic king Alaric, ruler of a vast confederation stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, found his traditional tactics useless against enemies who refused to engage in the close combat that Gothic warriors had mastered. Hunnic forces would approach Gothic formations, unleash devastating arrow storms, then retreat before Gothic infantry could close to effective fighting range. This process could be repeated indefinitely, wearing down Gothic resistance through casualties and exhaustion, while preserving Hunnic strength for decisive strikes. Archaeological evidence from Gothic cemeteries dating to this period reveals the traumatic impact of Hunnic expansion on established barbarian societies. Burial sites show evidence of hasty interment, incomplete grave goods, and defensive positioning that suggests communities under constant threat. weapon deposits indicate changes in military equipment, with increased emphasis on armor and shields designed to counter arrow attacks, rather than the lighter gear suitable for combat against other infantry forces. The Hunnic military system achieved its effectiveness through the integration of superior mobility, advanced weaponry, and tactical flexibility that allowed rapid adaptation to different combat situations. Hunnic armies could cover enormous distances in minimal time, appearing without warning to strike targets hundreds of miles from their previous known positions. Roman frontier commanders found their intelligence networks useless against enemies whose movements could not be predicted or tracked through conventional reconnaissance methods. The organization of Hunnic military campaigns reflected sophisticated logistical planning that enabled large forces to operate across vast territories without fixed supply lines. Hunnic warriors carried minimal personal equipment, relying on their horses for transportation, their bows for hunting, and their herds for sustenance. Each warrior typically maintained multiple mounts, allowing continuous movement without rest periods that limited other cavalry forces. The Hunnic practice of drinking mare's milk and horse blood provided nutrition that could sustain warriors for extended periods without requiring supply trains or foraging that might reveal their positions to enemies. Hunnic siege warfare initially relied on intimidation and blockade rather than the elaborate engineering techniques employed by Roman armies. Early Hunnic campaigns against fortified positions involved surrounding strongholds with mounted forces that prevented supply deliveries, while conducting psychological warfare designed to break defender morale. Hunnic warriors would display captured enemy heads, torture prisoners within sight of fortress walls, and conduct mock attacks that demonstrated their numerical superiority while conserving their strength for more vulnerable targets. The evolution of Hunnic siege capabilities occurred through contact with Germanic peoples and Roman deserters, who provided technical knowledge of fortress construction and assault techniques. Archaeological evidence from sites like Aquincum reveals Hunnic adoption of battering rams, siege towers, and undermining techniques that enabled attacks on previously impregnable fortifications. This technological transfer represented a crucial development that allowed Hunnic forces to eliminate strongholds that might otherwise serve as bases for enemy resistance or refuges for civilian populations. The rise of Attila to supreme leadership of the Hunnic Confederation around 440 AD marked the transformation of nomadic raiding bands into a centralized military empire capable of challenging both Roman successor states simultaneously. Attila's consolidation of power involved eliminating rival claimants, including his own brother Bleda, through methods that demonstrated both political ruthlessness and military effectiveness. The unification of previously independent Hunnic clans under single leadership created an unprecedented concentration of nomadic military power that could field armies numbering in the tens of thousands. Attila's diplomatic strategies revealed sophisticated understanding of Roman internal politics and the opportunities created by the division between Eastern and Western imperial administrations. He exploited rivalries between Constantinople and Ravenna by negotiating separate agreements with each court while maintaining the threat of military action against both. Hunnic embassies to Roman capitals combined demands for tribute with intelligence gathering that provided detailed information about Roman military capabilities, political divisions, and economic resources. The Hunnic tribute system established by Attila's negotiations with Roman authorities created a form of protection racket that generated enormous wealth while avoiding the costs and risks of direct territorial conquest. Annual payments from both Roman courts provided Hunnic leaders with gold, silk, and luxury goods that could be distributed to maintain warrior loyalty and clan allegiance. These arrangements also included provisions for Hunnic access to Roman markets, allowing nomadic peoples to acquire manufactured goods and agricultural products that supplemented their pastoral economy. Attila's court, established at a permanent settlement somewhere in the Carpathian Basin, represented an unprecedented attempt to create a nomadic capital that could serve as an administrative center for a vast confederation of tribal peoples. Roman envoys who visited the settlement described elaborate wooden halls decorated with rich textiles and precious metals, surrounded by the tents and wagons of various tribal groups that had gathered to participate in Hunnic assemblies. The architectural evidence suggests a hybrid culture that combined nomadic mobility with elements of settled administration necessary for governing a territorial empire. The internal organization of Attila's empire relied on personal relationships between the supreme leader and subordinate chiefs, who maintained authority over their own tribal groups while acknowledging Hunnic overlordship. This system preserved traditional nomadic social structures while creating hierarchical command relationships that enabled coordinated military campaigns involving multiple ethnic groups. Germanic, Sarmatian, and Alanic warriors served alongside Hunnic cavalry in armies that could deploy diverse tactical capabilities according to specific combat requirements. The treatment of subject peoples within the Hunnic Empire varied according to their military value and potential for resistance. Germanic tribes that submitted voluntarily often retained their traditional leadership and internal organization, while providing warriors for Hunnic campaigns and tribute for the imperial treasury. Peoples who resisted Hunnic expansion faced systematic destruction designed to eliminate future threats, while providing examples that encouraged submission from other potential opponents. Archaeological evidence from settlements destroyed during Hunnic expansion reveals the thoroughness of nomadic military campaigns when resistance was encountered. Sites across the Danube frontier show evidence of complete destruction, with buildings burned, defensive walls dismantled, and population centers abandoned permanently. The scale of destruction suggests deliberate policy rather than random violence, indicating Hunnic understanding of the psychological impact of total warfare on potential enemies. The military campaigns conducted under Attila's leadership demonstrated the evolution of Hunnic warfare, from raiding expeditions into systematic conquest designed to achieve specific political objectives. The invasion of Gaul in 451 AD involved careful coordination between multiple armies, extensive intelligence gathering about Roman defensive preparations, and diplomatic negotiations with potential allies among Germanic tribes already settled within Roman territories. This campaign represented the culmination of nomadic military development, combining traditional steppe tactics with strategic planning comparable to contemporary Roman military doctrine. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains revealed both the strengths and limitations of Hunnic military organization when facing coordinated opposition from multiple enemy forces. Attila's army included not only Hunnic cavalry, but also Germanic infantry, Sarmatian lancers, and various other tribal contingents whose tactical capabilities complemented nomadic archery. The Roman coalition assembled by Aetius similarly combined legionary infantry with Germanic federates and Visigothic cavalry, creating a military force that could match Hunnic tactical diversity. The aftermath of this battle demonstrated the fragility of nomadic political structures that depended entirely on the personal authority of individual leaders. Although the engagement ended without decisive victory for either side, the failure to achieve the rapid success that Hunnic warfare required began the process of Confederation disintegration that would accelerate following Attila's death. The withdrawal from Gaul represented not military defeat, but the recognition that traditional nomadic tactics had reached their strategic limitations against properly organized opposition. Attila's subsequent invasion of Italy in 452 AD revealed the continuing effectiveness of Hunnic military pressure against isolated targets, while demonstrating the logistical challenges of sustained campaigns in unfamiliar terrain. The rapid capture of Aquileia and other northern Italian cities showed that Hunnic siege techniques had evolved sufficiently to overcome urban fortifications, but the decision to withdraw without attacking Rome reflected practical limitations rather than diplomatic considerations. The death of Attila in 453 AD precipitated the immediate collapse of Hunnic imperial unity as rival claimants competed for succession, while subject peoples exploited the opportunity to regain independence. The nomadic political system that had enabled rapid expansion under effective leadership proved incapable of maintaining cohesion during succession crises. Germanic tribes that had served as Hunnic federates quickly reasserted their autonomy, while rival Hunnic clans began fighting among themselves for control of the confederation's accumulated wealth and prestige. The Battle of Nidau in 454 AD marked the definitive end of Hunnic dominance over the barbarian world, when a coalition of Germanic peoples defeated the divided Hunnic forces and killed Attila's eldest son, Alaric. This victory enabled the Gepids, Ostrogoths, and other Germanic tribes to establish independent kingdoms in territories previously controlled by the Hunnic Empire. The rapid dissolution of nomadic power demonstrated the fundamental instability of political systems based entirely on personal authority and military success. The legacy of Hunnic expansion extended far beyond the brief period of their imperial dominance, fundamentally altering the demographic and political landscape of Europe through the population movements and cultural exchanges that their conquests had initiated. Germanic peoples displaced by Hunnic pressure had established new kingdoms throughout former Roman territories, while the collapse of centralized nomadic power created opportunities for Slavic expansion into regions previously dominated by Germanic and nomadic peoples. The Hunnic period thus represented a crucial transitional phase that connected the classical barbarian migrations with the medieval European political order that would emerge from the ruins of Roman imperial authority, and it was in those ruins that the most dramatic transformation would occur. For the collapse of Hunnic power created a vacuum that ambitious Germanic leaders rushed to fill, none more successfully than Alaric I of the Visigoths, whose calculated manipulation of Roman internal divisions would culminate in the unthinkable, the sack of the Eternal City itself. The collapse of Hunnic imperial authority created a power vacuum that ambitious Germanic leaders rushed to fill, none more successfully than Alaric I of the Visigoths, whose calculated manipulation of Roman internal divisions would culminate in the unthinkable, the sack of the Eternal City itself. By 395 AD, Alaric had emerged as king of the Visigothic Confederation, following years of service as a Roman foederatus, a position that provided him with intimate knowledge of imperial military capabilities and political weaknesses. His transformation from Roman ally to existential threat reflected the fundamental instability of barbarian-Roman relationships during the empire's final century. Alaric's early career demonstrated the complex loyalties that characterized late imperial politics, where barbarian leaders navigated between service to Rome and advancement of their own people's interests. He had commanded Gothic auxiliaries during Theodosius's campaigns against the usurper Eugenius, fighting alongside Roman legions at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394 AD. The Gothic contribution to this victory proved decisive, with Visigothic warriors absorbing enormous casualties while breaking the enemy line through their characteristic wedge formations. Despite this sacrifice, Alaric received no recognition from the new emperor Honorius, a slight that transformed a valuable ally into a dangerous enemy. The political chaos following Theodosius's death in 395 AD provided Alaric with opportunities to exploit Roman weakness while building Visigothic power. The division of imperial authority between Honorius in the west and Arcadius in the east created competing centers of power that barbarian leaders could manipulate through shifting alliances and territorial demands. Alaric initially aligned himself with Constantinople, accepting the title of Magister Militum per Illyricum from Arcadius, while using this position to consolidate control over Gothic settlements in the Balkans. The Visigothic military organization under Alaric combined traditional Germanic warrior bands with tactical innovations learned through service in Roman armies. Gothic infantry retained their preference for close combat with spears and long swords, but Alaric supplemented these forces with cavalry units trained in Roman fighting methods and siege equipment, operated by craftsmen familiar with imperial engineering techniques. This military synthesis created armies capable of both guerrilla warfare in mountainous terrain and conventional battles against Roman field forces. Alaric's invasion of Italy in 401 AD marked the beginning of a decade-long campaign that would expose the hollow nature of Western imperial defenses. His forces crossed the Julian Alps during winter months, when Roman commanders expected seasonal truces, achieving strategic surprise that allowed rapid penetration into the Po Valley. The speed of this advance caught Roman authorities unprepared, forcing the evacuation of the imperial court from Milan to the more defensible position of Ravenna, behind extensive marshlands and naval protection. The siege of Milan demonstrated Visigothic adaptation of Roman siege techniques to overcome urban fortifications that had previously provided security against barbarian raids. Alaric's forces constructed earthwork ramps, deployed battering rams, and conducted systematic attacks on gate structures using methods learned during their service as Roman auxiliaries. The city's eventual relief by Stilicho's army prevented its capture, but the psychological impact of barbarian forces threatening major Italian cities shattered Roman confidence in traditional frontier defenses. Stilicho's counteroffensive revealed both the continued effectiveness of professional Roman military organization and the growing dependence on barbarian federates for imperial defense. His victory at Pollentia in 402 AD relied heavily on Alanic cavalry and Hunnic mounted archers fighting alongside depleted legionary units. The battle itself demonstrated the evolution of late imperial warfare, with Roman forces adopting barbarian tactical elements while maintaining superior discipline and coordination under experienced commanders. The aftermath of Pollentia illustrated the complex relationship between military victory and political resolution in barbarian Roman conflicts. Despite his tactical defeat, Alaric retained most of his forces and continued to threaten Italian security from bases in the eastern Alps. Stilicho's inability to destroy the Visigothic army completely reflected logistical constraints and political considerations that prevented sustained campaigns against enemies who could retreat into inaccessible mountain terrain. Alaric's subsequent negotiations with Honorius's court revealed sophisticated understanding of Roman administrative procedures and legal frameworks. His demands included not only territorial grants for Gothic settlement, but also official recognition of his authority over these lands and annual subsidies to maintain Gothic military service. These negotiations represented attempts to formalize barbarian settlement within imperial territories through legal mechanisms that preserved Roman sovereignty while acknowledging barbarian autonomy. The murder of Stilicho in 408 AD eliminated the last effective defender of the Western Empire and provided Alaric with the opportunity he had long sought. Stilicho's execution, ordered by Honorius in response to senatorial accusations of treason, removed the only Roman commander capable of coordinating effective resistance against Gothic pressure. The subsequent massacre of barbarian families serving in Roman armies drove thousands of Germanic warriors into Alaric's forces, swelling his military strength at the moment when Roman defenses reached their lowest point. Alaric's march on Rome in 408 AD represented the culmination of Gothic military evolution from tribal raiding bands into a disciplined army capable of conducting complex strategic operations. His forces moved through central Italy with remarkable speed, avoiding fortified positions while targeting supply lines and communication networks that sustained Roman administrative control. The systematic nature of this campaign demonstrated military planning that rivaled contemporary Roman strategic doctrine. The first siege of Rome revealed the city's vulnerability to enemies who understood the economic foundations of urban survival. Alaric positioned his forces to control the Tiber River and the major roads connecting Rome with its agricultural hinterland, creating a blockade that gradually starved the population while preserving Gothic strength for more decisive actions. The siege lasted several months, during which food prices increased exponentially and civilian morale collapsed under the pressure of impending starvation. The Gothic camp outside Rome's walls presented a spectacle that shattered Roman assumptions about barbarian capabilities and organization. Archaeological evidence from similar Germanic settlements reveals the sophisticated logistics required to maintain large military forces in fixed positions for extended periods. Gothic warriors constructed earthwork fortifications, organized supply systems, and maintained discipline that impressed even hostile Roman observers. The presence of Gothic families, craftsmen, and merchants within these camps demonstrated the extent to which the Visigoths had evolved from nomadic raiders into a mobile nation seeking permanent territorial settlement. Roman negotiations with Alaric during this first siege revealed the desperation of imperial authorities faced with enemies they could neither defeat militarily nor satisfy politically. The Senate authorized payments of 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, and vast quantities of luxury goods, including silk garments and pepper, to secure Gothic withdrawal. These enormous sums represented a significant portion of the empire's remaining liquid wealth, demonstrating the extent to which barbarian pressure had disrupted imperial finances. The temporary resolution achieved through these payments proved unsustainable because it addressed symptoms rather than fundamental causes of barbarian Roman conflict. Alaric withdrew from Rome but remained in Italy with his forces intact, continuing to demand territorial grants and official recognition that Honorius's government could not provide without acknowledging the collapse of imperial authority. The Gothic king's position as an armed negotiator within Roman territory created an unprecedented situation that existing diplomatic frameworks could not resolve. Alaric's second siege of Rome in 409 AD demonstrated increased Gothic capabilities in urban warfare and political manipulation. His forces had acquired additional siege equipment and engineering expertise during their extended presence in Italy, enabling more effective attacks on the city's fortifications. Simultaneously, Alaric exploited divisions within the Roman Senate by supporting the elevation of Priscus Attalus as a rival emperor, creating a political alternative to Honorius that legitimized Gothic demands while fragmenting Roman resistance. The establishment of Attalus as emperor revealed Alaric's sophisticated understanding of Roman constitutional procedures and the importance of legal legitimacy in imperial politics. Rather than simply demanding tribute through military threats, the Gothic king created a puppet government that could issue official decrees authorizing barbarian settlement and military appointments. This strategy demonstrated political acumen that surpassed many contemporary Roman leaders in its appreciation of legal forms and administrative requirements. The failure of the Attalus experiment illustrated the limitations of barbarian political innovation when faced with entrenched Roman institutional resistance. Despite holding Rome and controlling the imperial treasury, the puppet emperor could not secure recognition from provincial governors or military commanders who remained loyal to Honorius. The Gothic-sponsored government lacked the administrative apparatus necessary to govern effectively beyond the immediate vicinity of Rome itself. Alaric's decision to depose Attalus and resume direct negotiations with Honorius reflected pragmatic recognition that political manipulation could not substitute for military conquest when dealing with Roman institutional resistance. The Gothic king's willingness to abandon his puppet emperor demonstrated flexibility that characterized successful barbarian leadership during this period. Leaders who could adapt their strategies to changing circumstances proved more effective than those who remained committed to single approaches regardless of results. The Third Siege of Rome in 410 AD culminated in the event that contemporaries considered impossible: the capture and sack of the Eternal City by barbarian forces. Alaric's entry into Rome occurred through treachery rather than assault, with Gothic forces gaining access through the Salarian Gate, opened by sympathetic elements within the city. This method of capture reflected the extent to which Roman society had fragmented under barbarian pressure, creating internal divisions that enemies could exploit. The sack itself lasted 3 days and followed patterns established during previous Gothic victories over Roman settlements. Visigothic warriors systematically looted public buildings, private residences, and religious structures, while generally respecting the sanctuary rights of churches. Archaeological evidence from contemporary destruction layers in other cities suggests that Gothic forces focused primarily on portable wealth rather than wanton destruction, indicating disciplined military behavior rather than random violence. The psychological impact of Rome's fall reverberated throughout the Mediterranean world, shattering assumptions about Roman invincibility that had persisted for centuries. Christian writers like Jerome expressed shock that the city which had conquered the world could itself be conquered by barbarians, while pagan intellectuals attributed the disaster to abandonment of traditional gods. The event marked a symbolic turning point that demonstrated the irreversible decline of Western imperial power. Alaric's death shortly after the sack of Rome prevented him from capitalizing on his unprecedented achievement. His successor Athalf inherited the challenge of transforming military victory into sustainable political arrangements that could provide security for the Visigothic people. The transition of leadership occurred at a crucial moment when Gothic forces controlled enormous wealth but lacked secure territorial bases for permanent settlement. Athalf's marriage to Galla Placidia, Honorius's sister, captured during the sack of Rome, represented an attempt to legitimize Visigothic claims through dynastic alliance with the imperial family. This union symbolized the extent to which barbarian leaders sought integration with Roman political structures, rather than simple destruction of imperial authority. The wedding ceremony, conducted with imperial regalia in a Roman palace, demonstrated Gothic appreciation for the prestige associated with Roman constitutional forms. The establishment of the Visigothic kingdom in southwestern Gaul marked the successful conclusion of Alaric's strategic vision, achieved by his successors through continued military pressure and diplomatic negotiation. The Foedus of 418 AD granted the Visigoths extensive territories around Toulouse in exchange for military service against other barbarian groups threatening Roman interests. This arrangement represented the first formal recognition of an independent barbarian kingdom, within former Roman territories. Visigothic settlement in Gaul involved complex arrangements between Gothic nobles and Roman landowners that preserved existing agricultural systems while establishing new political hierarchies. Archaeological evidence reveals continuity in villa construction and agricultural techniques, suggesting that Gothic settlements supplemented rather than replaced existing populations. The integration of Roman and Gothic elites through intermarriage and shared administrative responsibilities created hybrid ruling classes that governed through combinations of Germanic custom and Roman law. The Breviary of Alaric, promulgated in 506 AD, represented the culmination of Visigothic legal development and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of jurisprudential principles derived from both Germanic tradition and Roman precedent. This law code addressed the complex legal relationships that emerged from barbarian settlement among Roman populations, establishing procedures for resolving disputes between different ethnic groups, while maintaining distinct legal traditions for each community. Visigothic conversion from Arianism to Catholic Christianity under King Richard in 589 AD eliminated the primary source of religious conflict between Gothic rulers and their Roman subjects. This conversion facilitated political integration while preserving Gothic ethnic identity through continued use of Germanic names, burial customs, and material culture. Archaeological evidence from Visigothic cemeteries reveals the persistence of traditional grave goods and burial orientation alongside Christian symbols, indicating religious synthesis rather than complete cultural assimilation. The Vandal Confederation under Alaric pursued a different path toward barbarian state formation, emphasizing naval power and Mediterranean commerce rather than territorial integration with Roman populations. Vandal migration from the Danube frontier to North Africa represented one of the most remarkable achievements in barbarian military history, involving the movement of approximately 80,000 people across hostile territory to establish a kingdom in regions they had never previously inhabited. Alaric's conquest of North Africa exploited Roman civil wars and religious divisions that weakened imperial defenses at the crucial moment when Vandal forces crossed from Spain. The Vandal king demonstrated strategic insight comparable to the greatest Roman commanders in his recognition that control of Africa's grain exports would provide leverage over both Western and Eastern imperial governments. His rapid capture of Hippo Regius and Carthage established Vandal control over the economic foundations of Roman power in the Western Mediterranean. The Vandal fleet, constructed under Alaric's direction, represented the most formidable naval force in the Mediterranean during the 5th century AD. Archaeological discoveries of Vandal shipyards and harbor installations reveal sophisticated understanding of naval architecture and maritime logistics that enabled systematic raiding throughout the Mediterranean basin. Vandal vessels combined Germanic construction techniques with Mediterranean design elements, creating ships capable of both riverine operations and open ocean voyages. Alaric's sack of Rome in 455 AD demonstrated the effectiveness of Vandal naval strategy and the vulnerability of Italian coastal cities to seaborne attack. Unlike Alaric's prolonged siege, the Vandal assault achieved surprise through amphibious landing that bypassed Roman frontier defenses entirely. The systematic looting that followed revealed Vandal appreciation for portable wealth and artistic treasures that could be transported to Africa for redistribution among the Confederation's supporters. But while the Visigoths and Vandals carved out their kingdoms from Roman territory, another Germanic people was quietly building something far more enduring in the forests and river valleys of northern Gaul. The Franks would prove to be the most successful of all the barbarian peoples, not because they were the strongest or the most numerous, but because they made a choice that would change the course of European history. The collapse of Vandal power in North Africa coincided with the emergence of a far more enduring barbarian success story in the forests and river valleys of northern Gaul, where Frankish chieftains had been quietly building the foundations of what would become medieval Europe's dominant political force. Unlike the dramatic migrations and conquests that characterized Visigothic and Vandal expansion, Frankish ascendancy developed through gradual territorial consolidation, strategic alliance building, and the crucial decision to align themselves with Catholic Christianity rather than the Arian heresy that had isolated other Germanic kingdoms from their Roman subjects. The transformation of the Franks from a loose confederation of Germanic warriors into the dominant power of Western Europe represents one of history's most remarkable political evolutions. Under Clovis and his successors, the Merovingian dynasty would accomplish what no other barbarian kingdom managed: the creation of a lasting state that would eventually give birth to both France and Germany. Clovis's conversion to Catholic Christianity, rather than the Arian Christianity favored by other Germanic kings, proved to be a masterstroke of political genius. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Burgundians had all adopted Arianism, which taught that Christ was subordinate to God the Father. This theological distinction might seem trivial to modern observers, but in the 5th and 6th centuries, it created an unbridgeable gulf between Germanic rulers and their Roman subjects. The Catholic bishops of Gaul, who controlled vast wealth, extensive networks of influence, and the loyalty of the Roman population, viewed Arian kings as heretics. They cooperated with these rulers out of necessity, but their hearts remained with the Orthodox faith. When Clovis accepted baptism from Bishop Remigius of Rheims around 496 CE, he gained something no amount of military conquest could provide: legitimacy in the eyes of the Church. Gregory of Tours, writing his history of the Franks in the late 6th century, portrayed Clovis's conversion as a dramatic battlefield revelation. According to this account, Clovis was losing a battle against the Alemanni when he called upon the Christian God, promising to convert if granted victory. The tide turned, the Alemanni fled, and Clovis kept his word. The historical reality was probably more complex. Clovis's wife Clotilde was already a Catholic Christian, and she had been working on her husband's conversion for years. The political advantages of Catholicism were obvious to anyone with strategic vision. But Gregory's dramatic narrative served an important purpose. It presented Clovis as a new Constantine, a warrior king chosen by God to defend the true faith. The baptism ceremony itself was designed to maximize its symbolic impact. Remigius reportedly told Clovis to bow your head, proud Sicambrian, worship what you have burned, burn what you have worshipped. 3,000 Frankish warriors were baptized alongside their king, creating a new Christian army in a single dramatic ceremony. This mass conversion gave Clovis a powerful tool for expansion. When he moved against the Visigothic kingdom in 507 CE, he could present himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator freeing Catholic Romans from Arian oppression. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Vuil, where Clovis personally killed the Visigothic king Alaric II in single combat. The victory at Vuil transformed the political map of Western Europe. The Visigoths were driven from most of Gaul, retreating to their Spanish territories. Clovis absorbed the wealthy regions of Aquitaine, gaining access to Mediterranean trade routes and the sophisticated Roman administrative systems that still functioned in southern Gaul. But Clovis's ambitions extended beyond mere territorial expansion. He sought to create a new kind of kingdom, one that combined Germanic military traditions with Roman administrative efficiency and Christian moral authority. The Salic law, codified during his reign, represented this synthesis perfectly. The Salic law was not simply a collection of tribal customs written down for convenience. It was a sophisticated legal code that addressed the complex realities of a mixed society. Germanic warriors lived alongside Roman landowners, Catholic bishops administered justice in their dioceses, and merchants from across the Mediterranean conducted business in Frankish markets. The law had to accommodate all these groups while maintaining social order. One of the most famous provisions of the Salic law concerned inheritance. Women were excluded from inheriting land, a provision that would later be used to justify the exclusion of women from the French throne. But this rule reflected practical concerns about military service. Land ownership carried obligations to provide warriors for the king's army, and women could not fulfill these obligations personally. The law also established the system of Wehrgild, or man price, that would characterize Germanic legal systems for centuries. Every person had a value, determined by their social status, and anyone who killed them owed this amount to their family. A free Frank was worth 200 solidi, a Roman landowner 100 solidi, a slave much less. This system seems barbaric to modern sensibilities, but it served a crucial function. It provided an alternative to blood feuds that could devastate communities for generations. Clovis died in 511 CE, having united most of Gaul under Frankish rule, but his death revealed a fundamental weakness in the Merovingian system, the Frankish tradition of dividing kingdoms among all male heirs. Clovis's 4 sons split his realm, and for the next 2 centuries, the history of the Franks would be marked by constant civil wars as various branches of the family fought for supremacy. These civil wars were not simply struggles for power, they were conflicts between different visions of kingship. Some Merovingian kings sought to maintain the Roman administrative traditions that Clovis had adopted, while others preferred the older Germanic model of personal rule through warrior bands. The tension between these approaches would never be fully resolved. The most notorious of these conflicts pitted 2 queens against each other in a struggle that would inspire centuries of literature and legend. Brunhilde, a Visigothic princess who married into the Merovingian family, represented the Roman tradition of centralized administration. Fredegund, a former slave who became queen through her beauty and ruthlessness, embodied the raw power politics of the Germanic world. Their feud lasted for decades, consuming the lives of kings, princes, and countless ordinary people. Gregory of Tours documented their machinations with a mixture of horror and fascination, recording poisonings, assassinations, and betrayals that would make a modern thriller writer envious. Brunhilde was eventually captured by Fredegund's son and executed by being torn apart by horses, a fate that reflected both the brutality of the age and the fear that powerful women inspired in their male contemporaries. Despite this political chaos, Frankish society continued to evolve. The church grew increasingly powerful, with bishops serving as administrators, judges, and diplomats. Monasteries spread across the countryside, preserving classical learning while developing new agricultural techniques. The great abbey of Saint-Denis, near Paris, became a center of royal patronage and would eventually serve as the burial place of French kings. The economy of Merovingian Gaul was more sophisticated than traditional narratives suggest. Long-distance trade continued, though at reduced levels compared to the Roman period. Frankish merchants traveled to Constantinople, bringing back silk, spices, and luxury goods. The gold coins minted by Merovingian kings circulated throughout Western Europe, facilitating commerce and demonstrating royal prestige. Archaeological evidence reveals a society in transition. Frankish graves from this period contain a mixture of Germanic and Roman objects, weapons and jewelry in traditional styles alongside Christian symbols and Mediterranean imports. The famous treasure of Childeric, Clovis's father, discovered in 1653, included a golden bull's head, hundreds of golden bees, and a signet ring bearing the king's portrait in Roman style. The Merovingian period also saw the development of new artistic traditions that would influence European culture for centuries. The intricate metalwork of Frankish craftsmen, with its interlacing patterns and animal motifs, represented a fusion of Germanic, Celtic, and Mediterranean influences. Illuminated manuscripts produced in Frankish monasteries preserved classical texts while developing new decorative styles. But by the 7th century, the Merovingian kings were losing their grip on power. The constant civil wars had weakened royal authority, while the great noble families had grown increasingly independent. The position of mayor of the palace, originally a household official, became the real center of power as kings retreated into ceremonial irrelevance. The Carolingian family, which held the mayoralty in the eastern Frankish kingdom of Austrasia, gradually accumulated power over several generations. Charles Martel, mayor of the palace in the early 8th century, became famous for his victory over Muslim raiders at the Battle of Tours in 732 CE, a battle that later generations would celebrate as saving Christian Europe from Islamic conquest. The historical significance of Tours has been debated by modern scholars. The Muslim force was probably a raiding party rather than an invasion army, and the Islamic expansion into Europe had already reached its natural limits. But the battle's symbolic importance was immense. Charles Martel became a hero of Christendom, and his family's prestige soared. Charles's son Pepin the Short took the final step, deposing the last Merovingian king and claiming the throne for himself in 751 CE. To legitimize this usurpation, Pepin sought and received papal approval, the first time a pope had sanctioned the overthrow of a ruling dynasty. In return, Pepin intervened in Italy to protect the papacy from Lombard aggression, establishing a relationship between the Frankish monarchy and the Roman Church that would shape European history for centuries. Pepin's son would take this relationship to its ultimate conclusion. On Christmas Day, 800 CE, Pope Leo III placed a crown on the head of Charles, known to history as Charlemagne, and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The Roman Empire, dead in the West for over 3 centuries, was reborn, at least in theory. Charlemagne's empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. It was the largest political unit Western Europe had seen since the fall of Rome, and it represented the culmination of the process that had begun when the first Germanic warriors crossed the Rhine. The barbarians had not destroyed Roman civilization. They had transformed it into something new. While the Franks were building their empire in Gaul, another Germanic people was creating a remarkable civilization on the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigoths, driven from Gaul by Clovis's conquests, established a kingdom in Spain that would last for over 2 centuries and leave an indelible mark on Spanish culture and identity. The Visigothic Kingdom of Spain represented one of the most successful examples of Romano-Germanic synthesis. Unlike some other barbarian kingdoms, where Germanic warriors formed a distinct ruling caste separate from the Roman population, the Visigoths gradually merged with their subjects to create a unified society. This process was neither quick nor easy, but its results were profound. When the Visigoths first arrived in Spain in the early 5th century, they were Arian Christians ruling over a Catholic population. This religious divide created tensions that threatened the stability of the kingdom. Visigothic kings attempted various solutions. Some persecuted Catholics, others sought compromise. Still others converted to Catholicism themselves, only to face rebellion from Arian nobles. The breakthrough came in 589 CE, when King Reccared publicly converted to Catholicism at the Third Council of Toledo. This was not simply a personal religious decision, it was a political revolution that transformed the nature of Visigothic kingship. Reshaped announced his conversion with the words, "Just as I was led by God to recognize the true faith, so I wish to lead my people to it." The conversion of the Visigoths to Catholicism had immediate and far-reaching consequences. The Catholic bishops, who had previously viewed their Germanic rulers with suspicion, became enthusiastic supporters of the monarchy. The councils of Toledo, which met regularly throughout the 7th century, became a kind of parliament where bishops and nobles together advised the king on matters of law and policy. The legal unification of the kingdom followed religious unification. King Regiswinth promulgated the Liber Iudiciorum in 654 CE, a comprehensive legal code that applied equally to Goths and Romans. This code, later known as the Fuero Juzgo, would remain the basis of Spanish law for centuries, influencing legal development long after the Visigothic kingdom itself had fallen. The Liber Iudiciorum was a remarkable document that reflected the sophisticated legal thinking of 7th century Spain. It drew on Roman law, Germanic custom, and Christian moral teaching to create a coherent system of justice. The code addressed everything from property rights and inheritance to criminal punishment and judicial procedure. One of the most striking features of the Liber Iudiciorum was its treatment of torture. Roman law had permitted torture as a means of extracting testimony from slaves and, in certain cases, from free persons accused of serious crimes. The Visigothic code restricted the use of torture, requiring judicial authorization and limiting the methods that could be employed. This represented a significant advance in legal protection for the accused. The code also addressed the status of Jews, who formed a significant minority in Visigothic Spain. Unfortunately, the treatment of Jews deteriorated markedly during the 7th century, with successive councils of Toledo imposing increasingly harsh restrictions. Jews were forbidden from holding public office, owning Christian slaves, or practicing their religion openly. These persecutions would have long-term consequences, creating resentments that some historians believe contributed to the rapid Muslim conquest of Spain in 711 CE. Visigothic Spain was not merely a political entity, it was a cultural powerhouse that preserved and transmitted classical learning during the darkest period of the early Middle Ages. The great scholar Isidore of Seville, who served as bishop from around 600 to 636 CE, compiled the Etymologiae, an encyclopedia that attempted to summarize all human knowledge. The Etymologiae was organized around the origins of words, reflecting the ancient belief that understanding a thing's name revealed its essential nature. Isidore drew on classical sources, Pliny, Aristotle, Cicero, as well as Christian writers and his own observations. The result was a work of staggering ambition that would serve as a standard reference throughout the medieval period. Isidore's influence extended far beyond his encyclopedia. He wrote histories, theological treatises, and scientific works. He organized the Spanish Church, standardizing liturgical practices and establishing educational requirements for clergy. He corresponded with scholars throughout the Mediterranean world, maintaining intellectual connections that the political fragmentation of the post-Roman world had threatened to sever. The material culture of Visigothic Spain reflected its position at the crossroads of multiple traditions. Visigothic churches, with their horseshoe arches and intricate stone carvings, combined Roman building techniques with Germanic decorative sensibilities. The famous votive crowns of the Visigothic kings, discovered in the 19th century at Guarazar, displayed goldwork of extraordinary sophistication. These crowns were not meant to be worn. They were offerings to churches, suspended above altars as symbols of royal piety. The largest, belonging to King Regiswinth, is adorned with sapphires, pearls, and hanging letters that spell out the king's name. The craftsmanship rivals anything produced in Constantinople, demonstrating that Visigothic Spain was no cultural backwater. The economy of Visigothic Spain remained relatively robust compared to other post-Roman kingdoms. The peninsula's agricultural wealth, grain, olive oil, wine, continued to flow to Mediterranean markets. Spanish horses were prized throughout Europe. The mining operations that had made Spain valuable to Rome continued, though at reduced levels. Cities, while smaller than in Roman times, remained important centers of administration, commerce, and religious life. Toledo, the Visigothic capital, was a thriving metropolis where Gothic nobles, Roman aristocrats, Jewish merchants, and Christian clergy mingled in the streets. The city's churches and palaces, though largely destroyed by later construction, must have been impressive monuments to Visigothic power. But the Visigothic kingdom suffered from a fatal weakness: the lack of a stable succession system. Unlike the Franks, who divided kingdoms among royal heirs, the Visigoths elected their kings from among the nobility. In theory, this system allowed the most capable candidate to assume power. In practice, it led to constant civil wars as rival factions fought for the throne. The chronicles of Visigothic Spain record a depressing litany of assassinations, rebellions, and coups. Of the 35 kings who ruled between 531 and 711 CE, at least 15 were murdered or overthrown. This political instability prevented the development of strong central institutions and left the kingdom vulnerable to external threats. The end came with shocking suddenness. In 711 CE, a Muslim army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and defeated the Visigothic king Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete. Within a few years, almost the entire peninsula was under Muslim control. The Visigothic kingdom, which had seemed so powerful and permanent, vanished almost overnight. The rapid collapse has puzzled historians for centuries. How could a kingdom with such sophisticated institutions, such cultural achievements, such military traditions, fall so quickly? Part of the answer lies in the political divisions that plagued Visigothic Spain. Some nobles apparently welcomed the Muslim invaders as allies against their domestic rivals. Part lies in the military superiority of the Arab and Berber forces, hardened by decades of conquest across North Africa. But the Visigothic legacy did not disappear entirely. In the mountains of Asturias, a small group of Christian warriors maintained their independence, beginning the centuries-long process of reconquista that would eventually restore Christian rule to the entire peninsula. These warriors claimed descent from the Visigoths, and the kingdoms they founded, Leon, Castile, Aragon, would eventually unite to form modern Spain. The legal and cultural traditions of Visigothic Spain also survived. The fuero juzgo remained in use in Christian territories throughout the medieval period. Isidore's writings continued to be copied and studied. The horseshoe arch, a distinctive feature of Visigothic architecture, was adopted by Muslim builders and became a hallmark of Moorish style. Of all the barbarian peoples who carved kingdoms from the corpse of the Roman Empire, none had a more dramatic or improbable history than the Vandals. Their journey from the frozen forests of Scandinavia to the sun-baked shores of North Africa, their creation of a maritime empire that terrorized the Mediterranean, and their sudden annihilation by Byzantine forces make for one of history's most remarkable stories. The Vandals first appear in Roman records during the 2nd century CE, when they inhabited regions along the Baltic coast. Like other Germanic peoples, they were drawn into the orbit of Roman civilization, trading amber and furs for Roman manufactured goods. But they remained beyond the frontier, watching as the empire's power waxed and waned. The great migrations of the late 4th and early 5th centuries set the Vandals in motion, Pushed by the Huns and pulled by the opportunities that Roman weakness presented, they crossed the Rhine on the last day of 406 CE, along with the Alans and Suevi. This crossing marked the beginning of an odyssey that would take them across the entire breadth of the Roman world. The Vandals spent several years ravaging Gaul before crossing the Pyrenees into Spain in 409 CE. There they established themselves in the southern region of Baetica, which still bears a corrupted form of their name, Andalusia. But Spain proved to be merely a way station. Pressure from the Visigoths, who were expanding their own territory, forced the Vandals to seek new lands. In 429 CE, under their king Alaric, the Vandals made the fateful decision to cross into Africa. According to tradition, they were invited by the Roman governor Boniface, who was engaged in a power struggle with the imperial court at Ravenna. Whether this invitation actually occurred is debated by historians, but the result was clear. Approximately 80,000 Vandals, including women, children, and elderly, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and began their conquest of Rome's richest provinces. The African provinces were the breadbasket of the Western Empire, supplying grain to Rome and generating enormous tax revenues. They were also home to a sophisticated urban civilization, with cities like Carthage rivaling any in the Mediterranean world. The Vandal conquest of these territories was a catastrophe for the Western Empire, depriving it of resources it desperately needed. Alaric proved to be one of the most capable rulers of the migration period. Despite a physical disability, he was lame from a fall from a horse. He combined military genius with diplomatic cunning. He captured Carthage in 439 CE, giving the Vandals control of the western Mediterranean's greatest port. He built a fleet that made the Vandals masters of the sea, a remarkable achievement for a people with no maritime tradition. The Vandal fleet terrorized the Mediterranean for decades. In 455 CE, Alaric led his forces to Rome itself, taking advantage of political chaos following the assassination of Emperor Valentinian III. The Vandals spent 2 weeks systematically stripping the city of its treasures, carrying off everything of value, including the sacred objects from the Temple of Jerusalem that Titus had brought to Rome 4 centuries earlier. This sack of Rome gave the Vandals their enduring reputation for mindless destruction. The very word vandalism derives from their name, but the reality was more complex. Alaric forces did not burn Rome or massacre its inhabitants. They were methodical looters rather than wanton destroyers, and Pope Leo I reportedly negotiated with Alaric to limit the violence. By the standards of ancient warfare, the sack of 455 was relatively restrained. The Vandal kingdom in Africa was a peculiar entity. Unlike any other barbarian state, the Vandals remained a distinct warrior elite, refusing to intermarry with the Roman population or adopt Roman customs. They were fervent Arian Christians who actively persecuted the Catholic majority, confiscating church properties and exiling bishops. This religious policy created deep resentments that would eventually contribute to their downfall. Yet the Vandal kingdom was not simply a military occupation. Alaric and his successors maintained much of the Roman administrative apparatus, collecting taxes and administering justice through established institutions. The great estates that had made Africa wealthy continued to produce grain, olive oil, and wine. Carthage remained a thriving commercial center, its harbors filled with ships from across the Mediterranean. The cultural life of Vandal Africa was surprisingly vibrant. Latin poetry flourished at the Vandal court, with poets composing elaborate verses praising their Germanic patrons in classical meters. The African Church, despite persecution, produced important theological works. The mosaics and buildings of this period show no decline in artistic quality from the Roman era. Archaeological excavations have revealed the material prosperity of Vandal Africa. wealthy villas with elaborate bath complexes, fine pottery imported from across the Mediterranean, jewelry and metalwork of high quality, all testify to a society that was far from the barbaric wasteland of popular imagination. The Vandals had not destroyed Roman civilization in Africa. They had taken it over and, in their own way, maintained it. Gaiseric ruled for nearly 50 years, dying in 477 CE at an advanced age. He had transformed a wandering tribe into a Mediterranean power, humbled the Roman Empire, and created a kingdom that seemed destined to endure. But his successors lacked his abilities, and the Vandal kingdom began a slow decline. The religious persecution continued, and even intensified under later kings, alienating the Catholic population and the powerful African church. The Vandal military, which had once terrorized the Mediterranean, grew complacent and soft. The warrior traditions that had carried the Vandals from the Baltic to Africa faded as generations passed in the comfortable African climate. The end came in 533 to 534 CE, when the Byzantine Emperor Justinian launched a campaign to reconquer the lost western provinces. His general Belisarius, one of history's greatest military commanders, landed in Africa with a relatively small force, perhaps 15,000 men. The Vandal king Gelimer, caught off guard, was unable to mount an effective defense. The campaign was astonishingly swift. Belisarius defeated the Vandals in 2 major battles, captured Carthage, and pursued Gelimer into the interior. Within a year, the Vandal kingdom had ceased to exist. Gelimer was captured and brought to Constantinople, where he was paraded in Justinian's triumph, the last barbarian king to suffer this ancient Roman humiliation. The Vandals themselves simply disappeared from history. Unlike the Goths or Franks, who merged with local populations to form new peoples, the Vandals left no descendants, no successor states, no lasting cultural legacy. Their century of African rule became a historical curiosity, remembered mainly for the sack of Rome and the word that bears their name. Yet the Vandal story illuminates important truths about the migration period. It shows how a relatively small group of determined warriors could exploit Roman weaknesses to carve out a kingdom. It demonstrates the possibilities and limitations of barbarian rule. The Vandals could conquer and maintain a sophisticated province, but they could not fully integrate with its population, and it reveals the fragility of these new kingdoms, which could rise to power in a generation and vanish just as quickly. The Lombards were the last of the great Germanic peoples to establish a kingdom on Roman soil, and their arrival in Italy in 568 CE marked the final chapter of the migration period. For over 2 centuries, they would rule much of the Italian peninsula, leaving a legacy that shaped Italian culture, law, and even language. The region of Lombardy still bears their name. The Lombards' origins lay in Scandinavia, like so many Germanic peoples, but their migration southward had been long and circuitous. They appear in Roman sources as early as the 1st century CE, when they inhabited regions along the lower Elbe River. Over the following centuries, they gradually moved southward and eastward, eventually settling in Pannonia, the region that is now Hungary. In Pannonia, the Lombards came into contact with the remnants of Attila's empire and absorbed influences from the steppe peoples. Their material culture from this period shows a mixture of Germanic and nomadic elements, elaborate horse gear, distinctive weapons, and jewelry that combined multiple traditions. They also converted to Arian Christianity, setting the stage for future conflicts with the Catholic population of Italy. The opportunity to invade Italy came from an unexpected source. The Byzantine Empire, which had reconquered Italy from the Ostrogoths in a devastating 20-year war, was exhausted and overextended. The plague of 541 to 542 CE had killed perhaps a third of the empire's population. The Persians were pressing on the eastern frontier. Italy, ravaged by war and disease, was defended by inadequate forces. King Alboin led the Lombards across the Alps in 568 CE, accompanied by a diverse coalition that included Gepids, Bulgars, Saxons, and other peoples. The invasion met little resistance. City after city fell or surrendered, and within a few years, the Lombards controlled most of northern and central Italy. Only Rome, Ravenna, and a few coastal enclaves remained in Byzantine hands. The Lombard conquest was different from earlier barbarian invasions in important ways. The Lombards did not seek to preserve Roman institutions or cooperate with the Roman aristocracy. They came as conquerors, seizing lands and reducing the Roman population to subordinate status. The sophisticated administrative systems that the Ostrogoths had maintained largely collapsed. This harsh initial period gave way to gradual accommodation. The Lombards could not rule Italy without the cooperation of the Roman population, and over time, the two groups began to merge. Intermarriage became common, legal distinctions blurred, and a new Lombard-Italian society emerged. The conversion of the Lombards to Catholicism, completed by the mid-7th century, accelerated this process. The Lombard kingdom was never fully unified. In addition to the main kingdom in the north, with its capital at Pavia, two semi-independent duchies, Spoleto and Benevento, controlled much of central and southern Italy. These duchies often pursued their own policies, sometimes allying with the Byzantines or the papacy against their nominal overlords in Pavia. This political fragmentation had lasting consequences for Italian history. The division between north and south, between different regional powers, became a permanent feature of the Italian landscape. The Lombards never succeeded in unifying the peninsula, and their failure set the pattern for the political fragmentation that would characterize Italy until the 19th century. Despite their political divisions, the Lombards developed a sophisticated legal system that influenced European law for centuries. The Edictum Rothari, promulgated by King Rothari in 643 CE, was the first written code of Lombard law. It was composed in Latin, reflecting the ongoing influence of Roman culture, but its content was distinctly Germanic. The Edictum Rothari is a fascinating document that reveals much about Lombard society. It established elaborate scales of compensation for injuries, with different amounts depending on the victim's status and the nature of the wound. A free Lombard who lost a thumb was entitled to more compensation than one who lost a little finger. The thumb was more valuable for wielding a sword. Women were protected by their male relatives, who could claim compensation for injuries to their honor. Later kings added to and modified Rothari's code, creating a body of law that addressed the increasingly complex needs of Lombard society. King Liutprand, who ruled from 712 to 744 CE, was particularly active as a legislator, issuing numerous laws that reflected both Germanic traditions and Christian moral teaching. His laws on marriage, inheritance, and property rights showed a society in transition from tribal customs to more sophisticated legal concepts. The material culture of Lombard Italy was distinctive and influential. Lombard metalwork, with its intricate interlacing patterns and stylized animal motifs, represented a fusion of Germanic, Mediterranean, and Byzantine influences. The gold crosses and jewelry found in Lombard graves display craftsmanship of the highest order. Lombard architecture, though less well preserved, included churches and palaces that combined Roman building techniques with new decorative sensibilities. The Lombards also left their mark on the Italian language. Numerous Italian words derive from Lombard origins, particularly terms related to warfare, law, and rural life. Words like guerra, war, guardia, guard, and albergo inn all have Lombard roots. The very name Italy was preserved and transmitted through Lombard usage, ensuring its survival into the modern era. The relationship between the Lombards and the papacy was complex and often hostile. The popes, caught between Lombard pressure and Byzantine neglect, sought allies wherever they could find them. They appealed to the Franks, cultivating a relationship that would eventually transform European politics. When the Lombard king Aistulf threatened Rome in the 75 OH, Pope Stephen II crossed the Alps to seek Frankish aid. The Frankish intervention proved fatal to Lombard independence. Pepin the Short campaigned in Italy twice, forcing the Lombards to cede territory to the papacy and establishing Frankish influence in Italian affairs. His son Charlemagne finished the job, conquering the Lombard kingdom in 774 CE and adding the title King of the Lombards to his growing collection of royal dignities. The Lombard kingdom in the north thus came to an end, absorbed into the Carolingian Empire. But the southern duchy of Benevento maintained its independence for centuries longer, preserving Lombard traditions and identity. The Lombard princes of southern Italy would play important roles in the complex politics of the medieval Mediterranean, sometimes allying with Byzantines, sometimes with Muslims, sometimes with the new Norman adventurers who would eventually conquer them. While the Great Migrations were reshaping the European continent, a parallel transformation was occurring on the island of Britain. The Anglo-Saxon settlement of England created a new society that would eventually produce one of the most influential cultures in world history, but the process was long, complex, and often violent. The Roman withdrawal from Britain in the early 5th century left the island's Romano-British population vulnerable to attacks from multiple directions. Irish raiders struck the western coasts, Picts pressed from the north, and Germanic pirates, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes raided the eastern and southern shores. The traditional narrative, preserved in sources like Gildas and Bede, describes how the British invited Saxon mercenaries to help defend against the Picts, only to have these mercenaries turn on their employers and seize the land for themselves. The historical reality was probably more complex than this simple story of invitation and betrayal. Archaeological evidence suggests a gradual process of settlement and cultural change rather than a sudden conquest. Germanic artifacts appear in British contexts. British traditions persist in areas of Germanic settlement, and the genetic evidence indicates significant continuity of population. The Anglo-Saxon settlement was as much a cultural transformation as a population replacement. Nevertheless, the transformation was profound. Within 2 centuries, most of lowland Britain had become culturally Germanic. The Celtic British language retreated to the western and northern fringes, Wales, Cornwall, and the regions that would become Scotland. Latin, which had been the language of administration and education, virtually disappeared. A new society emerged, organized around Germanic principles of kinship, lordship, and warrior honor. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that emerged from this process were numerous and constantly shifting. The traditional heptarchy, 7 kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex, is a later simplification of a much more complex political landscape. Smaller kingdoms rose and fell, absorbed by more powerful neighbors or fragmenting through inheritance disputes. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity, beginning with Augustine's mission to Kent in 597 CE, transformed English society. The Church brought literacy, connecting England to the wider world of Latin Christendom. Monasteries became centers of learning and artistic production. The great illuminated manuscripts of Northumbria, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Codex Amiatinus, rank among the supreme achievements of medieval art. The Anglo-Saxon Church also produced scholars of European significance. Bede, the monk of Jarrow, who wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, was the greatest historian of the early Middle Ages. His work established the practice of dating events from the birth of Christ, the ad system that we still use today. Alcuin of York became the leading intellectual at Charlemagne's court, helping to shape the Carolingian Renaissance. Anglo-Saxon literature, composed in the vernacular rather than Latin, created a body of poetry that has no parallel in early medieval Europe. Beowulf, the great epic of a hero's battles against monsters, preserves Germanic legendary traditions in Christian dress. The elegiac poems, the Wanderer, the Seafarer, the Ruin, express a melancholy beauty that still moves readers today. This literary tradition would eventually contribute to the development of English as a major world language. The political history of Anglo-Saxon England was marked by the gradual emergence of larger, more powerful kingdoms. Northumbria dominated in the 7th century, producing the golden age of Northumbrian culture. Mercia rose to prominence in the 8th century under kings like Offa, who built the great dike that still marks the Welsh border, and corresponded with Charlemagne as an equal. Wessex would eventually unite England under a single crown. The Viking invasions of the 9th century nearly destroyed Anglo-Saxon civilization. Danish armies conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia, establishing the Danelaw where Scandinavian law and custom prevailed. Only Wessex under King Alfred the Great maintained its independence, and even Alfred was reduced at one point to hiding in the marshes of Somerset. Alfred's achievement in preserving and then expanding Wessex laid the foundation for the eventual unification of England. He reformed the military, creating a system of fortified towns, burhs, that could resist Viking attacks. He promoted education and literacy, personally translating Latin works into English. He established a legal code that drew on earlier traditions, while adapting them to new circumstances. Alfred's successors continued his work, gradually reconquering the Danelaw and bringing all of England under West Saxon rule. By the mid-10th century, the Kingdom of England existed as a unified political entity, one of the most precocious examples of state formation in medieval Europe. The sophisticated administrative systems developed by Anglo-Saxon kings would later be inherited and expanded by their Norman conquerors. The final century of Anglo-Saxon England saw both remarkable achievements and ultimate catastrophe. The Benedictine Reform movement transformed English monasticism, producing new centers of learning and artistic production. The magnificent churches built during this period, some of which still stand, testify to the wealth and ambition of late Anglo-Saxon society. But the kingdom faced renewed Scandinavian pressure. Danish invasions in the late 10th and early 11th centuries culminated in the conquest of England by King Knut, who ruled a North Sea empire that included Denmark, Norway, and England. After Knut's death, the Anglo-Saxon dynasty was restored under Edward the Confessor, but his death in 1066 without a clear heir set the stage for the Norman conquest. The Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest that followed ended Anglo-Saxon England as a political entity, but the Anglo-Saxon legacy endured. The English language, though transformed by Norman French influence, retained its Germanic core. English legal traditions, including the jury system and concepts of individual rights, had Anglo-Saxon roots. The very idea of England as a unified nation was an Anglo-Saxon creation. The centuries of migration and settlement that we have traced transformed Europe more profoundly than any other period in its history. The Roman world, with its unified Mediterranean civilization, gave way to a new order characterized by political fragmentation, cultural diversity, and the gradual emergence of the nations that would shape the modern world. This transformation was not simply destruction followed by rebuilding. It was a complex process of fusion, adaptation, and innovation that created something genuinely new. The barbarian kingdoms were not failed attempts to restore Rome. They were experiments in creating new forms of political and social organization suited to changed circumstances. The most important of these innovations was the partnership between Germanic kings and the Christian Church. This alliance, which began with Clovis's conversion and reached its culmination with Charlemagne's coronation, created a new model of Christian kingship that would dominate European political thought for a millennium. Kings ruled by divine right, but they also had obligations to protect the church, maintain justice, and care for the poor. The church, for its part, gained unprecedented influence over secular affairs. Bishops served as royal advisors, administrators, and diplomats. Church courts handled matters of marriage, inheritance, and moral behavior. The monasteries preserved classical learning while developing new knowledge in agriculture, medicine, and technology. The medieval synthesis of faith and reason, which would produce the great cathedrals and universities, had its roots in the barbarian kingdoms. The legal systems developed during this period represented another crucial innovation. The barbarian law codes, Celtic, Visigothic, Lombard, Anglo-Saxon, were not simply written versions of tribal custom. They were sophisticated attempts to create workable legal systems for mixed societies where Germanic warriors lived alongside Roman populations. These codes influenced European law for centuries and contributed to the development of concepts like individual rights and due process. The economic changes of the migration period were equally significant. The complex monetized economy of the Roman Empire gave way to a simpler system based more heavily on land and agricultural production. Long-distance trade declined but never disappeared entirely. New patterns of economic organization emerged, including the great estates that would evolve into the manorial system of the High Middle Ages. The transformation of cities illustrates these changes vividly. Roman cities had been centers of administration, commerce, and culture, with populations in the tens or even hundreds of thousands. The cities of the barbarian kingdoms were smaller, often centered on cathedrals and episcopal administration rather than secular commerce. But they remained important nodes in networks of power and exchange, and they would eventually grow into the great urban centers of medieval Europe. The artistic and cultural achievements of the barbarian kingdoms deserve recognition that they have not always received. The intricate metalwork of Germanic craftsmen, the illuminated manuscripts of Irish and Anglo-Saxon monasteries, the architectural innovations of Visigothic Spain, all represent genuine creativity, not mere imitation of Roman models. These traditions would contribute to the distinctive visual culture of medieval Europe. The migration period also saw the emergence of new ethnic identities that would shape European history. The Franks, Visigoths, Lombards, and Anglo-Saxons were not primordial peoples with unchanging identities. They were new formations that emerged through the process of migration and settlement. People of diverse origins came together under new names, adopting shared traditions and creating new ones. The nations of modern Europe are the distant descendants of these creative acts of identity formation. The relationship between the barbarian kingdoms and the Byzantine Empire deserves special attention. Constantinople remained the greatest city in the Christian world, the heir to Roman traditions of law, administration, and culture. The Byzantine emperors never abandoned their claim to the western provinces, and Justinian's reconquests showed that this claim could sometimes be enforced, but the reconquests ultimately failed. Italy, ravaged by decades of war, fell to the Lombards within a few years of Justinian's death. Africa, recovered from the Vandals, would eventually fall to the Arab conquests. The future of Western Europe lay not with Byzantine restoration, but with the new kingdoms that had emerged from the migrations. The Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries completed the transformation of the Mediterranean world. The unity that Rome had created, a single political and economic system encompassing the entire Mediterranean basin, was shattered forever. The sea that had been a Roman lake became a frontier between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. This new configuration had profound consequences. Western Europe, cut off from the wealthy Eastern Mediterranean, was thrown back on its own resources. The Carolingian Empire, centered on the Rhine and the Seine rather than the Mediterranean, represented a decisive shift in European geography. The future centers of European civilization, Paris, London, the cities of the Rhineland, were all located far from the old Roman heartland. As we reach the end of our journey through the world of the barbarians, we must ask what it all means. What did these centuries of migration, conquest, and transformation accomplish? What legacy did the barbarian peoples leave to the world? The most obvious legacy is the map of Europe itself. The nations that emerged from the barbarian kingdoms, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, England, remain the major powers of the continent. Their boundaries have shifted over the centuries, but their basic identities were formed during the migration period. When we speak of French culture, or German philosophy, or English literature, we are speaking of traditions that have their roots in the barbarian kingdoms. The languages of Western Europe tell the same story. French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese evolved from the Latin spoken in the barbarian kingdoms, transformed by centuries of change but still recognizably descended from the language of Rome. English, though Germanic in its basic structure, absorbed so much Latin and French vocabulary that it became a unique hybrid. German preserved more of its Germanic character, but was shaped by the same historical forces. The political traditions of Western Europe also owe much to the barbarian period. The idea of kingship as a sacred office, limited by law and custom, emerged from the partnership between Germanic rulers and the Christian Church. The concept of a nobility with special rights and responsibilities developed from the warrior aristocracies of the barbarian kingdoms. Even democratic institutions like the English Parliament have roots in the assemblies where Germanic warriors gathered to advise their kings. The legal traditions of Western Europe bear the stamp of the barbarian period. The emphasis on written law, on established procedures, on the rights of the accused, all these have roots in the barbarian law codes. The very idea that law should be written down and publicly known, rather than held as secret knowledge by a priestly class, was a barbarian contribution to European civilization. The Christian Church, as it developed in Western Europe, was profoundly shaped by its experience in the barbarian kingdoms. The alliance between church and state, the role of bishops as political figures, the monastic movement with its combination of spiritual devotion and practical activity, all these emerged from the conditions of the post-Roman world. The medieval papacy, which would claim supreme authority over all Christian rulers, built on foundations laid during the barbarian period. But perhaps the most important legacy of the barbarians was the demonstration that civilization could survive catastrophic change. The fall of Rome seemed to contemporaries like the end of the world. The sophisticated urban civilization that had flourished for centuries appeared to be collapsing into chaos and barbarism. Yet out of that apparent catastrophe emerged new forms of social organization, new cultural achievements, new possibilities for human flourishing. The barbarians did not simply destroy Roman civilization. They transformed it. They took what was useful from the Roman heritage and combined it with their own traditions to create something new. The medieval world that emerged from this synthesis was different from the Roman world, but it was not inferior. It produced its own great achievements in art, literature, philosophy, and technology. It laid the foundations for the modern world. This lesson has relevance beyond the study of ancient history. Civilizations rise and fall, but human creativity and resilience endure. The end of one era is the beginning of another. The barbarians who seemed to be destroying civilization were actually building a new one. The word barbarian itself has undergone a transformation. What began as a Greek term for foreign speech became a Roman label for peoples beyond the frontier, then a medieval designation for non-Christians, and finally a modern term for anyone considered uncivilized or destructive. But the peoples we have studied, the Goths and Vandals, the Franks and Lombards, the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, were not barbarians in any meaningful sense. They were human beings responding to historical circumstances, creating new societies, and leaving legacies that endure to this day. The story of the barbarians is ultimately a story of human adaptability and creativity. Faced with the collapse of the greatest empire the world had known, diverse peoples found ways to survive, to prosper, and to build new civilizations. Their achievements deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes to Roman history, but as chapters in the ongoing story of human civilization. When we walk through the streets of Paris or London, when we speak English or French or German, when we invoke legal rights or participate in democratic institutions, we are living with the legacy of the barbarians. They are not strangers from a distant past. They are our ancestors, the builders of the world we inhabit. Understanding their story helps us understand ourselves. The transformation they accomplished, from the unified Roman world to the diverse nations of medieval and modern Europe, was one of the most significant in human history. It was not planned or intended. It emerged from countless individual decisions, from migrations and battles, from conversions and marriages, from laws written and traditions preserved. Yet the result was a new civilization that would eventually spread its influence across the globe. The barbarians, in the end, were not the destroyers of civilization. They were its transformers, its renewers, its unexpected heirs. Their story reminds us that history is not a simple tale of progress or decline, but a complex process of change and adaptation. Civilizations do not simply end, they evolve, they merge, they give birth to new forms. The barbarians understood this truth, even if they could not have articulated it. They built on the ruins of Rome, and what they built still stands.